On stupidity, a warning. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Good sense is the most equitably distributed thing in the world, wrote Descartes. And what about stupidity? Whether it oozes or drips, trickles or gushes, it's everywhere. Without borders and without limits. Sometimes it emerges as a gentle, almost bearable lapping, other times as a nauseating, stagnant swamp. Still other times, it's an earthquake, a storm, or a tidal wave that engulfs everything in its path, smashing, trampling, befouling. No matter what form it takes, stupidity splatters us all. Rumor has it that we ourselves are the source of it. I am no exception. The unbearable heaviness of being. Everyone sees bullshit, listens to it, and reads it every single day. At the same time, each of us is guilty of generating it, thinking it, pondering it, and speaking it aloud. We are all morons from time to time, spouting nonsense as we go about our lives, without any real consequences. The crucial thing is to be aware of it and to feel sorry about it, because to err is human, and admitting your faults is halfway to having them forgiven. There will always be those who take us for fools, but we recognize our own folly far too rarely. Apart from the perpetual purr of idiocy that surrounds us, day in, day out, there's also, sadly, the roar of the masters of stupidity, kings of stupidity, assholes with a capital A. Those assholes, whether you encounter them at work or at home, do not strike you as anecdotal. They hound you and harass you with their obstinacy and crass wrong-headedness, their unjustified arrogance. They prosper, they sign on the dotted line, and they would happily wipe out all of your opinions, emotions, and dignity with one stroke of the pen. They erode your morale and make you doubt there can be any justice in this vile world. No matter how hard you try, you cannot detect a speck of kindred connection in them. Stupidity is an unkept promise, a promise of intelligence and confidence that the idiots among us betray, traitors to humanity. These jerks are like dumb beasts, they're total animals. We might want to indulge them, to turn them into friends, but they're not on that level, which is to say, our level. They suffer from a disease that has no cure. And since they refuse to heal themselves, convinced they are one-eyed kings in the land of the blind, the tragicomedy is made complete. It's no surprise that people are fascinated by zombies, with the simulacrum of existence they embody, their intellectual vacuity, and their overwhelming, fundamental need to drag the living, the heroic, and the simply decent down to their own level. And that makes sense. Idiots, like zombies, want to eat your brains. These failed human beings never fail you. The worst thing about them is that they can sometimes be intelligent, or at least make a show of it. They're so skilled at transforming the lineaments of learning to the bars of a cage that they would gladly burn books, along with their authors, in the name of some ideology or of something they learned from some purported sage. Uncertainty makes you crazy, certainty makes you stupid. Morons will condemn you instantly, with no appeal possible and no extenuating circumstances admitted, on the sole basis of the appearances they glimpse through their narrow blinkers. They know how to rouse their sympathizers, to goad them to lynching in the name of virtue, custom, respect. The idiot hunts in a pack and thinks in herd fashion. As the Georges Brassens song goes, the plural is useless to mankind. Whenever more than four are gathered, you'll find a band of fools. He also declared, glory to the man who, lacking lofty ideals, contents himself with not being a nuisance to his neighbors. Alas! Our neighbors don't always return the favor. Not content with making you miserable, the irksome idiot is delighted with himself. Unshakably. He is immunized against self-doubt and convinced of his rights. The happy imbecile tramples your rights without a second thought. The fool takes his beliefs for truths graven in marble, whereas all true knowledge is built on sand. Uncertainty makes you crazy, certainty makes you stupid. You've got to choose your camp. The asshole thinks he knows better than you. Not only does he know what you should think, feel, and do with your 10 fingers, he knows how you should vote. He knows who you are and what's good for you better than you do. If you disagree with him, he will despise you, insult you, and assault you, literally and figuratively, for your own good. And if he can do that in the name of some higher ideal, he won't hesitate to attack the scum that your existence represents for him, with utter impunity. And here's a bitter truth. Justified self-defense is a trap. If you try to reason with an idiot or to change his mind, you're lost. The moment you decide it's your duty to improve him, the moment you think you know how he should think and act, the jig's up. There it is. Now you're the idiot, and you're naive to boot, since you think you're up to the challenge. Worse, the more you try to reform an idiot, the stronger he gets. He delights in seeing himself as a victim who annoys others, and who must for that reason be in the right. In reproving him, you allow him to believe in good faith that he's a hero of anti-conformity, someone who ought to be defended and admired. A member of the resistance. Tremble before the vastness of this curse. If you try to reform a moron, not only will you fail, you will also strengthen him and encourage imitators. Before, there was only one moron, now there are two. Fighting against stupidity only makes it stronger. The more you attack an ogre, the more souls he devours. The horse feathers of the apocalypse. Thus, there is no way that stupidity can lose its power. It's exponential. Are we living today more so than yesterday and less so than tomorrow in the golden age of idiocy? As far back as the written record extends, the greatest minds of their ages believed this to be the case. Maybe they were right at the time. Then again, maybe, like everyone else, they were just old fools. Nonetheless, the novelty of the contemporary era is that it would take only one idiot with a red button to eradicate all stupidity and the whole world. With it, an idiot elected by sheep who were only too proud to choose their slaughterer. The other great characteristic of our age is that, even if we admit that stupidity has not yet reached its pinnacle, we know that it has never before been so visible, so unabashed, so outspoken, and so peremptory. It's enough to make you despair of your benighted fellow man. On the other hand, who knows, it might inspire you to turn to philosophy to address the situation, given how hard it is of late to deny the vanity of everything and the narcissism of everyone, not to mention the inanity of appearances and the prevalence of sweeping judgments. If only a second Erasmus would write us anew in praise of folly. If only a new Lucretius would arise to bring us relief, and perhaps joy, which we could relish, safe on shore, as the ship of fools sinks in the swirl, sabotaged by its passengers, who cry for help as they drown. Like a greedy gourmand, we lick our lips at the prospect of that desirable nectar, the war of fools among themselves, hackles raised, egos cocked. Great minds think alike, small minds collide. As you struggle to remain a spectator, not an actor, in this battle scene, it would be foolhardy to imagine yourself less vulnerable to stupidity than your bitter, braying, miserable, agitated contemporaries. But if by chance you turn out to be right, what a victory! It's wiser to be modest. If you try to rise above the throng, you won't be forgiven. Escape from the herd, and you'll still be led to the slaughterhouse. Howl with the wolves, bleat with the sheep, but never go it alone. Everyone will cry foul. Needless to say, if you truly believe yourself to be smarter and more admirable than the average Joe, the fateful diagnosis is near at hand. You yourself are most likely an unwitting carrier of stupidity. Given the immensity of the catastrophe, the project of this book, which is to attempt to investigate stupidity, can hardly be anything but another act of folly. To tackle such a subject is to reveal yourself to be presumptuous, touchingly naive, or at the very least, exceedingly foolish. I know this very well, but it's time that a brave idiot entered the breach. With a little luck, this endeavor will prove merely ridiculous. And ridicule is not fatal. But stupidity is, and it will outlast us. At any rate, it will bury us. That is, unless it follows us into the grave. One final point, these reflections on fools are not restricted to the male of the species. Let female fools take comfort. Neither sex has a monopoly on stupidity. And so I proclaim, O idiots of every stripe and morons of all kinds, blowhards and bitches, genial dumbass and silly twats, dirty bastards and nasty ballbreakers, pathetic ninnies and evil louts, dunces and ditzes, oafs and space cadets, poor slobs and dizzy dames, lunkheads and airheads, scatterbrains and dingbats, lummoxes and nitwits, imbeciles, boobies, numbskulls, dolts, wastes of space, blockheads, zeros, clowns, dummies, dim bulbs, raging assholes, and empty-headed rubes, dickheads, pipsqueaks, lowlifes, daydreamers, mouth-breathers, pains in the ass and motor-mouths. This is your moment of glory. This book speaks only to you. But you will not recognize yourselves. Your devoted dumbass, Jean-Francois Marmion. The Scientific Study of Idiots. Serge Sacati, psychologist and researcher at the University of Southern Brittany. The ignorant man affirms, the scientist doubts, the wise man reflects. Aristotle. Is it possible to make a scientific study of idiots? It's a provocative question. We know of asinine studies, and studies on pointless jobs that have no social value and bring little personal satisfaction, but studies on idiots themselves? What would that even look like? Actually, if you look at the scientific literature in the psychological domain, you'll find that bullshit, in a general way, has been fairly well researched. In this sense, you could say that, yes, it's possible to conduct a scientific investigation of idiots, but in so doing, it's important to recognize that the study of idiots is no more or less than the study of all mankind. A portrait of the idiot can be drawn from some of the variables that different studies have explored. This will allow us to gain a relatively precise idea of the idiot and of some of their variations, such as the conceited, brutal blowhard, whose stupidity contains an element of toxic narcissism, not to mention a total lack of empathy. Stupidity and the short attention span. Rather than study the idiot as an object, psychological research focuses on understanding why people act like idiots sometimes. Studies of behavioral scripts show that most of the time people do not analyze their environment deeply before they act. They depend on familiar, habitual routine actions, which they execute automatically in response to internal or environmental factors. That's why, if you happen to be crying, there's always some moron standing by who says, "Hey, how are you doing?" That's as stupid as checking your watch a second time, right after you've just looked at it. When you want to know what time it is, you look at your watch. The script unfolds mechanically. This mechanism allows you to be inattentive, because the effect of the script is to reduce the amount of attention required to complete a task. Consequently, because you're not paying attention and are thinking of other things, you look at your watch without seeing it. The information is not retained, which is why you have to look again to check the time. It's stupid, isn't it? In the field of research on attentional resources, psychologists have demonstrated that people often are blind to change, and that even an important alteration is not always perceived by the individual. That's why, if you've lost 15 pounds on a diet, you always run into some asshole who doesn't see the difference. Research on the illusion of control allows us to understand why. For instance, you'll always find some jerk pressing the elevator button like a maniac when it's already been pressed. Studies on social influence show that when a moronic driver goes down a dead-end street, some idiot always follows him, and when you ask a contestant on a quiz show if it's the sun or the moon that revolves around the earth, the moron asks to poll the audience. Human beings tend to cast aside pure reason and expected values. The dumbest among us, as a rule, is the one whose outlook reflects the greatest divergence from the average of studied effects. Generally, his vision of the world is simplistic. He has trouble with large numbers, with square roots, with complexity, and indeed with the bell curve itself, where he is to be found on the fringes. Stalin once said, "The death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic." As a rule, people are more receptive to anecdotes than to scientific reports stuffed with figures. But the idiot devours anecdotes. He will know someone who fell 40 floors and didn't get a scratch. Anyway, that's what I heard on the news. Stupidity and faith. Studies of belief show that people have faith in justice, which is probably the most common shared belief on earth. The worst assholes illustrate how this belief can be misused when they say things like, "Sure, she was raped, but did you see how she was dressed?" The dumber a person is, the more likely he is to blame the victim. Another sort of asshole will deride the poor as filthy beggars. Idiots excel in their capacity to believe anything and everything, from folktales to conspiracy theories, from the moon's influence on behavior to the effectiveness of homeopathy. On May 28, 2017, a motorcycle was filmed driving several miles on the highway without its driver, who had fallen off. Some confirmed idiots attributed this phenomenon to the supernatural specter known as the woman in white. Brainier types put it down to gyroscopic effect. There seems to be a negative correlation between holding mystical beliefs and winning a Nobel Prize. 8 studies in the realm of belief always distinguish between the naive credulity of greenhorns and the entrenched stupidity of old fools. Point 10. It's been proven that negative memories fade with time, whereas positive memories endure. This is why the older a person gets, the greater his tendency to regard the past in a positive light, which is why old fools like to complain wistfully, "Everything was better in the good old days." A large swath of irrational human behavior has been scrutinized by psychologists, who have determined that it springs from the individual's need to control his environment. Every living organism expresses this need. This compulsion can result in absurd actions by members of the human species, like, for instance, going to see a psychic. There are about 100,000 people in France who declare themselves to be psychics. They earn more than $3 billion a year. Researchers have never identified any genuine gift in self-styled psychics, but that doesn't keep these so-called seers from benefiting their clients. It's estimated that 20% of women and 10% of men have consulted a psychic at least once in their lives. Generally, psychics report that they don't regret having chosen this fraudulent line of work to earn their crust. Apparently, idiots making other idiots the basis of their livelihood works perfectly well as a business model. The need for control is often accompanied by the illusion of control, and idiots probably delude themselves that they are in control more than others. 11.1 Proof of the power of this illusion can be shown through the everyday example of driving or riding in a car. When you are a passenger, you fear accidents much more than you do when you are the driver. There are some fools who find it impossible to sleep when they are passengers. Apparently they can sleep only when they're the driver. The idiot will throw the dice as hard as he can to get sixes. He will choose his own numbers in the lottery. He will stoop to pick up a penny for luck and make sure to avoid walking under ladders. The fool has everything under control. If he wins the lottery, it's because he dreamed of the number 6 for 6 nights in a row, and because 6 is equal to 36, he played the 36 and won. By the same token, it must be accepted that the idiot is in good mental health overall, because the illusion of control is much weaker among depressed people. Point 12. Studies about idiots that help explain your job. In another area studied widely by scientists, idiots have been found to employ an exceptionally wide range of strategies to shore up their self-esteem. Studies on bias and false consensus 13 demonstrate that people tend to exaggerate the number of other people who share their faults. This is why, when you point out to some jerk that he has blown past a stop sign, he will retort, "But nobody stops at this sign." The typical asshole often indulges in retrospective bias. At the maternity hospital, he'll say, "I was sure it was going to be a boy." As he stands in front of the television on election night, he'll declare, "I was sure Trump was going to be president," and sometimes when you're talking with him he'll tell you, "I knew you were going to say that." Is the idiot showing bad faith? Is the idiot a fortune teller? Not at all. The idiot deploys "I knew it" to strategic ends, to demonstrate that he's better informed than he really is. I know. Of course, you must never mention these studies to idiots, as they will deny that they do such things. To protect their self-esteem, many people overestimate their abilities. This bias has been proved by psychological experiments that demonstrate that, in multiple arenas, a large number of participants rate themselves higher than average in such categories as, for instance, intelligence and everything connected with it. On one side of the axis, you have those humble souls whose human qualities of simplicity, humility, and discretion lead others to perceive them as simple-minded or naive, and to criticize them for lack of confidence and treat them like dummies who can be easily manipulated. On the other side of the axis, you find the high achievers, which is to say, overconfident idiots. One of these smug morons can exact a high price on society when he gets lost at sea, or gets stranded in the mountains after off-piste skiing, even if he mostly contents himself with exaggerating his prowess at maintaining speed on the highway. Another form of bias, egocentric bias, 14, permits us to distinguish minor league imbeciles from the gigantic assholes who don't acknowledge their own role in stupidity. The jerk who's been divorced 3 times because all 3 of the women he married were bitches. The blowhard whose business failed because he was working with a bunch of losers. Even when he was a teenager, he claimed that it wasn't his feet that stank, it was his socks. One day he was stopped in his car for speeding. That was just bad luck. He can't understand that luck is the spin that assholes put on probability. The researchers David Dunning and Justin Kruger could not have published an article with a title like "Studies About Idiots That Help Explain Your Job." If they had presented their work that way, it never would have made it through peer review at a scientific journal. Yet in their research, this is what they abundantly demonstrated. These 2 specialists discovered that incompetent people tend to overestimate their own level of competence. That is why a fool who's never had a dog will tell you how to train yours. Dunning and Kruger attribute this tendency to the difficulty that unqualified people have, in certain contexts, with assessing their true abilities. But that's not all. According to these psychologists, 15, not only does the incompetent person overestimate his own level of competence, he also fails to recognize competence in those who possess it. Thanks to their research, we can understand why a stupid client will tell a professional how to do his job, and why when you lose something some moron is bound to say to you, "Wait, where was it the last time you saw it?" It also explains why a fool will feel compelled to say, "It's easy to be a lawyer, law is top of the head stuff, quitting smoking." Another form of bias, egocentric bias, 14, permits us to distinguish minor league imbeciles from the gigantic assholes who don't acknowledge their own role in stupidity. The jerk who's been divorced 3 times because all 3 of the women he married were bitches. The blowhard whose business failed because he was working with a bunch of losers. Even when he was a teenager, he claimed that it wasn't his feet that stank, it was his socks. One day he was stopped in his car for speeding. That was just bad luck. He can't understand that luck is the spin that assholes put on probability. The researchers David Dunning and Justin Kruger could not have published an article with a title like Studies About Idiots That Help Explain Your Job. If they had presented their work that way, it never would have made it through peer review at a scientific journal. Yet in their research, this is what they abundantly demonstrated. These 2 specialists discovered that incompetent people tend to overestimate their own level of competence. That is why a fool who's never had a dog will tell you how to train yours. Dunning and Kruger attribute this tendency to the difficulty that unqualified people have, in certain contexts, with assessing their true abilities. But that's not all. According to these psychologists, 15, not only does the incompetent person overestimate his own level of competence, he also fails to recognize competence in those who possess it. Thanks to their research, we can understand why a stupid client will tell a professional how to do his job, and why when you lose something some moron is bound to say to you, "Wait, where was it the last time you saw it?" It also explains why a fool will feel compelled to say, "It's easy to be a lawyer, law is top of the head stuff, quitting smoking, it's just a question of willpower, flying an airplane, it's like driving a bus," and so on. This is why when an idiot strolls out of a lecture on quantum physics of which he has not understood a single word, he will feel free to look the expert straight in the eyes and say, "Could be, could be." Dunning and Kruger suggest that if we were prudent we would be tempted not to vote in elections. Given how useless we are at economy, geopolitics, and running major institutions, we are incapable of evaluating electoral platforms or of having any idea how to improve the country's direction. All the same, any idiot at a bar will say, "I know how to solve the crisis." A number of studies conducted with Asian participants display an inverse Dunning-Kruger effect. 16, in other words, they underestimate their abilities. It appears that in the culture of the Far East, where the prevailing norm is to avoid standing out, the desire to prove that you've mastered every subject does not exist. Bullshit detector. Even though many more mechanisms could be included here to help us define stupidity, let's wrap up this short synthesis with a discussion of cynical mistrust, a quality in which the idiot and the asshole are more deeply steeped than other people. 17. Cynicism is defined as a collection of negative beliefs about human nature and its motivations. The asshole is often prey to socio-political cynicism. Just ask him. A few phrases punctuate his running commentary. They're all corrupt, a bunch of crooks and losers, psychologists, charlatans, every last one of them, journalists, bootlickers. They think that people who act honestly do so only out of fear of being caught. The asshole lives in a world of incompetence and deceit. Studies show that cynical idiots are so uncooperative and mistrustful that they miss out on professional opportunities and therefore earn less than others do. In sum, the idiot embodies a sort of exaggerated version of the various tendencies the researchers observed. An idiot who manages to accumulate all these tendencies will become the emperor of idiots, which is to say, the most gigantic asshole the earth has ever seen. But the key question, tied to our starting point, is it possible to make a scientific study of idiots, is probably, why are there so many idiots? Because it is undeniably true that there are. If you shout "poor bastard" in the street, every head will turn around. Once again, the scientific literature provides the answer, indeed, many answers. First of all, we're all equipped with a bullshit detector called negativity bias. Point 18. This is a tendency that leads us to give more weight, attention, and interest to negative things than to positive ones. Negativity bias has significant consequences on people's opinions, on their prejudices and stereotypes, on discrimination and superstition. As with housework, we notice the little things only when they haven't been done. It's because of our negativity bias that we find it easier to deal with an idiot than with a genius in a complex social setting. In addition, this bias leads us to read more meaning into a negative event than a positive one. If you're looking for something that you've lost at home, your reflex is to think that you didn't lose it. Someone else must have put it somewhere. Who took my? Ultimately, when anything fails, there's a tendency to think that there's a reason for it, that some idiot must have wrecked everything. And finally, let's note that researchers have discovered a fundamental distortion in the attribution process. Point 19. When you observe someone, you attribute their behavior to deep-dyed character, as opposed to any external factors that may be relevant. In many cases, you come to the natural conclusion, the guy's an idiot. As a result, when a car zooms past us, it must be because the driver is a brute, and not because one of his kids got hurt at school. When a friend doesn't answer an email for 2 hours, it's because he's angry, not because he had an internet outage. If a colleague hasn't handed in a file yet, it's because he's lazy, not because he's overworked. If a professor responds to me curtly, it's because he's a jerk, not because my question was stupid. This mechanism increases our tendency to spot idiots everywhere. Those are at least two of the reasons why we are so sensitive to stupidity. A taxonomy of morons. Jean-François Dordier, founder and editorial director of the magazines Le Cercle Sci and Sciences Humaines. There are multiple forms of intelligence. As psychologists assert, it stands to reason that there must also be an impressive range of forms of stupidity. Given the embryonic stage of development of this science and the dearth of authoritative studies, we should begin with an overview of representative samples. Backwardness. Backward, slow, ignorant, idiotic, useless, foolish, lug-headed, imbecilic, stupid, witless, cracked, silly, moronic, dippy. The vocabulary of stupidity is endless. These semantic riches reflect subtle gradations in meaning, variation in usage, and the effects of social trends. On the whole, however, the meaning always comes down to the same thing. Whatever the variety of epithets and metaphors, the fool is a person who is judged to be of reduced intelligence and limited mental scope. Thus, stupidity is always defined invidiously as a relative concept. A person is not inherently stupid. Put another way, stupidity is measured from a fixed point established by a person who considers himself superior. Rubes. Also known as rednecks or hillbillies, rubes are stupid, cruel, racist, and selfish. At least that's how the French satirist Cabot, who immortalized their traits in his comic strips, depicted them. They dominate the ranks of the voters who elect populist parties because they're stupid, which is to say they're incapable of political probity, and they rely on short-term logic and sweeping generalizations. Their thinking is categorical, everything is black or white, with no nuance. They're stubborn and obtuse, and rational arguments hold no sway with them. They won't ever back down from their opinions. They think what they think, period. They're cruel because, lacking any empathy, they seek out scapegoats and lash out at innocent victims like Arabs, blacks, and migrants in general. They're selfish because only one thing matters to them, their well-being and comfort, their pocketbook. But do these rubes conform to an actual psychological profile? If this were the case, it would be necessary to demonstrate an organic relationship between stupidity and cruelty. And yet, the link between these two qualities is only conjectural. A person can be stupid and kind, just as a person can be intelligent and cruel. Is that not the case of the caricaturists Cabot and Jean-Marc Reiser, who worked for a magazine called Harakiri, whose motto was stupid and nasty? Those men were not truly stupid. Nasty, that they often were. The universal idiot. They're all morons. This phrase is uttered, usually rather loudly, by someone sitting on a bar stool. But who is this they? Politicians, the voters who elect them, bureaucrats, incompetents, and by extension, pretty much everybody, since the phrase does not carry a lot of nuance. This absence of discernment in analysis, this arrogance that places itself above the common run of humanity to levy judgment on the rest of the world, these are almost foolproof signs that you're dealing with a true idiot. The peculiar nature of error is that it does not recognize itself, Descartes observed. This is especially true of stupidity. Obviously, a fool cannot recognize himself. On the contrary, he himself constitutes a kind of lightning rod of folly. Wherever you happen to be, if you hear someone declare they're all morons, you can be sure that there's a moron in the vicinity. Artificial stupidity. Computers are totally stupid. This assertion doesn't come from just anyone. Gerard Barry teaches computer science at the Collège de France. A specialist in artificial intelligence, he does not hesitate to challenge the speculations on the capacity of machines to surpass human intelligence. Certainly, artificial intelligence has made significant progress in the last 60 years. And certainly, machines can recognize images, translate texts, and produce medical diagnoses. In 2016, the DeepMind computer program AlphaGo succeeded in defeating one of the world's best players of Go, the Japanese game of strategy. While this performance was impressive, we should not overlook the fact that AlphaGo knows how to do only one thing: to play the game of Go. The same was true of the Deep Blue program that beat Garry Kasparov at chess in 1996, more than 20 years ago. All that these so-called intelligent machines do is develop an extremely specialized competence, which is taught to them by their human master. Speculations on the autonomy of machines that can learn on their own are nothing but myths. Machines don't know how to transfer skills acquired from one domain into another, whereas one of the basic mechanisms of human intelligence is analogical transfer. The strength of computers is the power of their memories to retain the work they've done, and their electrifying capacity for calculation. Learning machines that work on the principle of deep learning are not intelligent because they don't understand what they're doing. All that Google's automatic translation program does, for instance, is learn how to use a word in a given context, but it remains perfectly stupid in the process. In no case does it understand the meaning of the words it uses. This is why Gerard Barry feels justified in saying that, at root, the computer is completely stupid. Collective stupidity. Collective intelligence designates a form of group intelligence, as displayed by ants or neurons, for example. Each element in isolation is not capable of much, but as a group can produce great feats. By the magic of self-organization, ants are able to build hallways, bridal chambers, pantries, hatcheries, and ventilation systems in their anthills. Some of them practice agriculture, animal husbandry, etc. Even though its functioning remains unexplained, collective intelligence has become a respected model in a very short time, resting on the simple idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Collective decision-making and co-creation are better than individual decisions. Nonetheless, it sometimes happens that the many make a worse decision than the individual. Collective intelligence has its counterpart, collective stupidity. In groups, our capacity for good judgment can be severely reduced. In his studies on group norms, the psychologist Solomon Asch long ago addressed many well-known instances of this phenomenon. To name one, if a majority of people embraces a manifestly false and idiotic theory, others will go along with it merely because of the power of conformity. To name another instance, the false virtues of brainstorming. Take a group of 10 people and make them work together for half an hour on a project. At the same time, set another group to work in which each member works separately on the task. Gather up their reports. The proposals of the second group are much richer and more plentiful than the proposals of the first group. Put another way, sometimes the whole is less than the sum of its parts. It would be beside the point to conduct large-scale psychological experiments to investigate collective folly. Everything that could be proven in the lab is experienced every day in offices, where collective efforts and meetings produce so many stupid ideas that it's hard not to think that one foolish person had dreamed them all up on his own. Gullibility. What could be more gullible than a child? You can make a kid believe almost anything, that there's an old guy with a white beard somewhere up in the sky who travels in a flying sled pulled by reindeer, delivering gifts to good children, or that a little fairy hunts under pillows for baby teeth, which she replaces with a quarter when she finds one. Gullibility is a form of stupidity that is altogether appropriate to childhood. That, in any case, is what the psychologist John Piaget thought. The philosopher Lucien Levy-Bruhl thought that primitive peoples were very credulous, too, because of their animist beliefs in forest spirits endowed with magical powers, which proved, he thought, that the savages, like children, had not attained the age of reason. But with the advance of scientific research, it has become necessary to concede that children were not as naive as people thought. They accept that reindeer can fly, but only in a parallel universe that does not obey the laws that apply down here, where they know very well that reindeer can't fly. We ourselves, rational adults, are prepared to believe in the existence of particles that exhibit strange behaviors without any confirmation from experts. Some of these scientists are people of faith. Some of them even believed in the resurrection of Christ. These realizations have led psychologists and sociologists to take another look at what it means to be gullible. Gullibility can no longer be seen to reflect a lack of logic. Believing in things that appear to be unbelievable is related to a system of reference rather than to naivete or to an absence of discernment. At the end of his life, Lucien Levy-Bruhl admitted that he had been mistaken about the mentality of the primitives. It's to his credit that he acknowledged his error, a pretty rare occurrence in the world of philosophers. Slowness. When, at the end of the 19th century, Jules Ferry made primary education obligatory in France, it appeared that certain students were incapable of absorbing routine instruction. Two psychologists, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon, were asked to create an intelligence test in order to identify such children so that they could receive an adapted education. This test formed the basis of what would later become the famous IQ, the intelligence quotient. By convention, the average IQ of a population is 100%. The emergence of the IQ tests led to the definition of mental deficiency and its subtypes, from borderline deficiency, among those whose IQ was less than 80, to moderate deficiency, applying to those who scored between 50 and 65, to profound deficiency, with an IQ of 20 to 34. Still further below, with an IQ inferior to 20, are the profoundly backward. Today, the words retarded and impaired are out of favor in psychology. They have been replaced by euphemisms. We speak of learning disabilities, and we avoid the expressions handicapped and differently abled. In the same way, we no longer speak of geniuses or gifted children. We speak of precocious children or of children with high potential. This doesn't keep anyone, in practice, from using tests to classify children according to their degree of mental disability, so they can be guided to specialized methods of instruction. Imbecile, idiot. At the dawn of psychiatry, the terms imbecility and idiocy were used to describe people who displayed a very low level of intellect, who could not read, write, and in certain cases, speak. Philippe Pinel, the French physician who is sometimes called the father of modern psychiatry, considered Victor de Eleverin to be an idiot. Today the boy would be classified as autistic. In the words of the psychiatrist Jean-Étienne Esquirol, the idiot is an individual who knows nothing, is capable of nothing, and wants nothing. Every idiot embodies, more or less, the acme of incapacity. Dr. Paul Sallier, in his 1891 book Psychologie de l'idiot et de l'imbécile, Essai de psychologie morbide, devoted one chapter to idiots and imbeciles. Apologizing for the tardy progress of French psychology, as compared to English and American achievement in the science, he noted that there was no consensus on the right way to define idiocy or imbecility. Some use intelligence as the evaluative factor, others rely on language, still others apply moral considerations. Over time, psychologists would abandon the concept of the idiot. The only remnant of this notion that still pops up on occasion is the term idiot savant, though even there, the term savant syndrome is preferred. The profile, which incorporates certain cases of autism and of the developmental disorder known as Williams syndrome, is marked by deficits in language or in general intelligence, and also by unusual difficulties with mathematics, drawing, and music. For centuries, the village idiot was the archetype of an intellectually disabled person, the fool, the simpleton. Not too long ago, every village had its crackpot, who would be hired for menial tasks. This oaf was regarded as pleasant and harmless, always smiling and happy, laughing over nothing. He wasn't considered dangerous. In Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Dopey, with his beatific smile, big eyes, and crooked cap, illustrates the type. Loons. Loon is a cute way to talk about fools, not angry fools, but the dreamy kind caught up in a fantasy world. The loon is a step away from the weirdo, that is to say, a loon who does bizarre or excessive things, and the weirdo is not far removed from the freak, who, according to the rigorous National Center for Textual and Lexical Resources, is generally a fantasist who displays eccentric behavior. In current French usage, the expression freak out can mean horse around, show off, or act goofy, and it also approximates the French expression faire l'autre, to act like a clown. In English, get your freak on recently entered the Oxford English Dictionary, meaning, roughly, to engage in uninhibited sexual behavior, or to dance like a maniac. A theory of assholes. A conversation with Aaron James, professor of philosophy at the University of California, Irvine, and author. Of assholes, a theory. Q. According to your theory, what is an asshole? A. It's a man, or more rarely a woman, who accords himself special advantages in his social life and feels immune from reproach. The typical example is the asshole who cuts in line at the post office, granting himself a privilege that's normally reserved for pregnant women and emergencies. In the moment, he has no justification beyond feeling that he's rich, handsome, or smarter than everyone else, so his time is more valuable than theirs. If you ask him to stand in line like everyone else, either he won't listen, or he'll tell you to get lost. It's not that he despises other people, rather, it's that he doesn't think they deserve his attention. The moment that you don't understand how extraordinary he is, he decides you're unworthy of his interest. Q. Do assholes behave like assholes in every arena of their lives? A. Not necessarily. Someone can act like an asshole because he's going through a rough patch. It might be a bad week or some hangover from his adolescence. But for me, the bona fide asshole, the true asshole, is consistently an asshole in multiple arenas, but not in all of them. He might be an asshole at work and on the road, but not at home, or the other way around. The all-purpose asshole, who's an asshole whatever the context, is rare. Stalin appears to have been not only a genocidal maniac, but also an asshole in every sphere. Q. Can extremely cultured and intelligent people be the worst assholes? A. The worst? I don't know. In any case, they're as bad as everyone else. Intelligence doesn't keep you from being a serious asshole. It can even contribute to it by planting the idea in the skull of the asshole that he's above the throne. Along with financial prosperity and beauty, intelligence is one of the qualities that make it easier to admire yourself and to attract the good opinion of others. This means that privileged people have a much greater risk of becoming eminent assholes. Q. So you're saying that assholery has less to do with intelligence or attitude than with the way we conduct ourselves and our social lives? A. Yes, it has to do with social behavior, but the internal tripwire is the failure to show interest in others. Assholes think it's up to everyone else to adjust to them, no matter what the situation. Oftentimes, some of their friends will humor them in that. And so one part of it is the social dynamic, but the primary cause is something personal and deeply rooted that's very hard to dislodge. Q. Is an asshole who's aware of his assholery still an asshole? A. The problem is that an asshole can be well aware that that's what he is, and be proud of it. Yeah, I'm an asshole. That's your problem. Awareness isn't enough to change anything. The asshole is so entrenched in his assholery that it's hard for him to question his actions. But it's not impossible. If he has an existential crisis, or a car accident, or a tragedy, he might take stock of himself. Or when he gets old. But by that time, it's mostly because he's low on energy or testosterone. And that's still quite rare. You can't count on it. In any case, awareness in itself is not sufficient to deeply affect the conscience of an asshole. Q. Can children be assholes? Although you might think so, given the egocentrism they sometimes display, I don't think you can include assholery among their fixed character traits. They change too quickly for that. But adolescents can go through assholish phases, though most of them grow out of it. It's really only in adulthood that assholery becomes constant and systematic. Q. How many adults may be considered assholes? 1 in 10? 1 in 2? A. Everything depends on the culture, the subculture, and the social sphere. The ratio is much higher in the United States than in Canada, Italy, or Brazil or Japan. For that matter, pretty much nowhere has less assholery than Japan. Of course, this changes all the time. I think there are many more assholes in the United States today than there were in the past, and they're a lot more visible because of the media. 1 in 2 would seem too high to me, no matter which country, because every society depends on the civility and cooperation of its members for its survival, and that's not the strong suit of assholes. Q. How can the persistence of assholes be explained? Do they have an evolutionary advantage? Something probably went on with the behavior of primates and their masculine domination tactics, all those power games to reach the top that perpetuate the pattern of assholes believing themselves superior. But I don't think those factors played a very decisive role in the development of civilization and institutions, whose structure generally allows for the suppression of assholes. In a culture where individualism prevails, like the United States, they present more problems. Q. What can we do about them? Can we change them? A. I think they can change, but it's better not to get involved. Sometimes an asshole will be kept on in an organization because he brings in money, for example, or academic prestige. Robert Sutton was right to propose his no asshole rule, but that objective cannot always be achieved. A method must be found to marginalize them in multiple ways, and to join forces against them, because it's by dividing people against each other that assholes accomplish their goals. This is much easier in small groups than in a political context. But there's a lot society can do to reduce the number of assholes, even though it's hard, because they have a knack of blocking our path. Q. What about the assholes in our own families? A. This is both banal and very delicate. Often, you try to isolate the asshole. Sometimes it's that a woman can't, or doesn't want to, get divorced from an asshole, but tries her utmost to avoid him and to reduce contact with him. To preserve our mental health, there's often not much else we can do. Q. Are assholes happier than ordinary people? A. Good question. Plato and Aristotle formulated an objective vision of happiness, to act justly. That does not produce assholes. Also, the quality of assholes' relationships is abominable. All the same, whether he admits it to himself or not, and often this is not the case, an asshole may be happier than other people if you take a more subjective view of happiness, combining it with satisfaction. The asshole is satisfied with himself when he gets what he wants: attention, fame, money, power, prestige, everything he feels entitled to. But often, he can maintain his feeling of superiority only at the cost of enormous anxiety. Because, however good he is at this little game, and he's excellent at it, he needs to feel he's smarter than other people and to take them on, one against all, with no apologies, even in the thick of everyday interactions. Among dogs and gorillas, the male alpha often dies young because of the stress caused by keeping track of his rivals. Even if the asshole convinces himself that he's happy with his life, you'd like to say to him, you know, pal, if you were more accommodating, you'd be less stressed. Q. Are we secretly jealous of assholes? A. Not really. You can feel impotent, frustrated, indignant when you're confronted with someone who repulses you. How can a person be that way? Emulation doesn't enter into it. But when assholes succeed, you can feel jealousy. That's how you get famous, by acting like an asshole. I could have done that. But he thought of it first, and he was quicker about it. If you're a bit of an asshole yourself, you can appreciate the technique of a connoisseur. But when you see an asshole on the highway, it's contempt you feel in the end. Q. Should we feel grateful to an asshole, if only because he shows us that we're better than that? A. Even if you learn to get along with one, I don't think it's possible to feel gratitude for assholes unless they end up recognizing your value as a human being. You can always congratulate yourself on understanding them and handling them better, like I felt after I finished my book. But I feel no gratitude, because they do bad things for bad reasons with no consideration for me. They cause too many frustrations and problems. At the end of the day, I might sometimes think I've dealt with them or responded to them well, but I don't give them credit for it. I would have preferred not to have run into them. Q. In 2016, you devoted a book to the dangers posed by the election of Donald Trump. Do you consider him a supreme asshole, or is he worse than that? A. Yes, Donald Trump is a supreme asshole, and uber asshole, if you like. I mean by that he's an asshole who inspires respect and admiration for his mastery of the art of assholery, despite heavy competition from his peers. Assholes generally have to fight for the title of asshole and chief or baron of assholes, but few can match Trump's prowess at piling assholery upon assholery. Those who manage it for a time, like Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, often end up becoming more docile. Q. Were there any assholes among the world's illustrious philosophers? A. It's funny, but I've written about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose reflections on self-esteem are very important to our understanding of the mindset of assholes and the destructive dynamic it produces. But Rousseau himself abandoned his numerous children, and I believe I heard that he practically bought a 12-year-old girl and installed her in a little cottage to give him sexual favors. Despite his genius, in some ways he definitely resembles an asshole. Q. Have any assholes congratulated you on the success of your book about them? A. Yes, readers have written me to say, thank you for this book, my children gave it to me, and there's no question that I'm an asshole. Their comments have always been kind. Bravo, well played. And some have even sworn that it was going to change their life and that they were going to behave differently. Not at all. As for the assholes I don't know if they've read it or not. I try to limit my interactions with them as much as possible. Interview by Jean-Francois Marmion. From Stupidity to Hogwash. Pascal Engel, philosopher and director of studies at the École de Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. How shall we classify the various forms of stupidity? Moronic, idiotic, cretinous, silly, dumb, foolish, imbecilic, clueless, inept, and that supreme qualifier, fucking stupid. Do they all come down to the same thing? Is stupid the genus to which all the other species cling? In France, the word con could stand in for all the others. But how can the word stupidity even be defined, given the blurriness of its categories and the fact that they so often can be reduced to mere insults? It's hard to determine if all the different gradations represent actual, distinct qualities. Indeed, the vocabulary of stupidity is so ingrained in language and culture that it seems impossible to establish universal principles at all. Is tonto in Spanish really analogous to the French idiot? Is moron in American English the same as dunce in British English? Does asshole in English mean the same thing as canard in French? So great is the variety of forms of stupidity that, since antiquity, many of those who have taken on the task of attempting to define its essence have given up, choosing instead to give illustrations of it. Comedy and satire often attack human folly, and practitioners of the art from Aristophanes to Lucian, from Persius to Juvenal, from Erasmus to Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, from Molière to Voltaire, from Phaedo to Alfred Jarry, from P. G. Wodehouse to Flann O'Brien, have contributed so many incarnations of stupidity that it's hard to find any one unifying element. Ship of Fools? Circus? Pandemonium? Zoo? How are they different? Most of the taxonomists of folly have contented themselves with enumerating examples of it, and every time a philosopher tries to propound a theory, it's immediately disproved by others. Only literary authors, from Gustave Flaubert to Leon Bloy, from Robert Musil to Witold Gombrowicz, from Jean-Paul Sartre to Milan Kundera, would seem to be up to the job, but they don't go beyond the discouraging conclusion, that's the way it is. Degrees of stupidity. Even if the classification of stupidity is difficult, it's not impossible. Stupidity has degrees, which may be described by composite portraits of individual types. At the lowest step of the ladder is the dull-witted stupidity, literally bestial, of those whose intelligence is so low that it approaches the animal kingdom, perfectly embodying brute stupidity. It also applies to those who react to everything with befuddlement, lower lip drooping. This kind of denseness is earthbound and stony. Among the French, slang has mostly reduced this category to one word, con, the vulgar term for female genitalia. For men, though, a couple of other words sometimes come into play, scrotum or dickhead. One step higher up the ladder you find idiots and imbeciles, those whose understanding is so weak that their debility seems almost pathological. This category also includes cretins afflicted by congenital infirmities. Another step higher you find those who, while somewhat sharper than the brute contingent, are nice but bumbling. These are the simpletons, the ninnies, dolts, and nitwits. One step higher still, you find the fools. The fool does not necessarily lack for intelligence, and on occasion may show good judgment. But he deploys it badly, and is undermined by his vanity. He likes to circulate, and he needs the company of others. Whereas brutes are solitary, he is social. He's pompous and full of himself, like a conceited character in a Molière comedy. The fool is not passive. Often, like Flaubert's Bouvard and Pécuchet, he buzzes with activity. He isn't hostile to knowledge, and he's not incapable of acquiring it. His folly resides in the fact that he doesn't know how to apply it or to put it to use. At a level still higher than simple foolishness, you find what Musil calls sophisticated or intelligent stupidity, which he claims extends into the highest realms of wit. The intelligent fool can be very learned and cultivated. He may even sparkle in society, but his intelligence does not match his affectations. He comes up with ill-conceived and unwieldy plans, because, Musil tells us, he suffers from insufficient harmony between the whims of his emotion and the scope of his intellect, which is too small to contain them. Musil contrasts this stupidity, or intelligent foolishness, with honest stupidity, which bears the rosy cheeks of ordinary life. He often caricatures snobs who don't know why they admire something or someone, like Proust's Salinist Madame Verdurin, or the businessman Arnheim and General Stumm in Musil's The Man Without Qualities, or men with big plans, like the supposed author of Swift's A Modest Proposal. The sophisticated fool has a form of moral defect that, unlike other forms of stupidity, consists not of an inability to bend means to an end, but of blindness as to the nature of ends. This elevated form of stupidity is a vice, and those who are affected by it are wholly responsible for it. It is here where the prevalent idea of stupidity as an intellectual defect hits a wall. Quite often it's said that stupid people are also mean and cruel. They ignore and often despise moral values. But often enough, they also look down on intellectual values. Point 2. Folly and bullshit. This is where intelligent stupidity, or more properly, folly, to use the language of classic literature, comes into contact with what Harry Frankfurt has designated as bullshit. 3. Bullshit, according to his 1997 book on bullshit, is a type of discourse that literally consists of saying absolutely anything, without worrying whether it's true or false. The typical form it takes is gossip, whether fashionable gossip or idle chatter, of the kind encountered most often in journalism and advertising. A bullshitter is someone who speaks nonsense, which is why the French title of Frankfurt's book is The Art of Speaking Nonsense. But to bullshit is not to commit, or to speak, folly, absurdity, or stupidity. It is to systemically devalue not only the difference between true and false, but also truth itself. Frankfurt insists that the bullshitter is not a liar, because liars respect the norms of truth and depend on them to carry off their lies. The bullshitter, on the other hand, just doesn't care. But he's anything but stupid or a generator of stupidity. On the contrary, he's intelligent, but doesn't give a damn about the truth. That's why it's more appropriate to designate bullshit as hogwash. The production of hogwash, as opposed to simple foolishness, is folly in the second degree. It takes into account the values of truth and knowledge, but neither acknowledges them nor practices them. That's why, rather than lies, hogwash is a form of deception that can readily be seen in the public arena, for instance, in politics. In the 17th century, hogwash was represented by what was called the bel esprit, the wit, of whom Malebranche said, "The ignoramus and the bel esprit are equally shut off from the truth, the difference being that the ignoramus respects it, and the bel esprit despises it." The fool or the simple creature respects the worth of wit, and even pretends to serve it, even if he does so badly or unsuccessfully. The complicated fool, like the producer of hogwash, looks down on it. Hogwash may be regarded as the supreme arena for stupidity. Balzac's illustrious Gaudissart in the Comedy Humaine, Honoré Daumiers' caricatures, and Melville's The Confidence Man incarnated it in fiction. Donald Trump incarnates it in real life. A fool thinks too much. This classification of the forms of stupidity may appear rudimentary, but it has the advantage of emphasizing that stupidity is not, or is not only, an incapacity of understanding, an intellectual defect, or a deficit of judgment that puts an individual in a permanent or temporary state of inertia or lack of freedom. The same is true of the Greek term moria and the Roman term stultitia, which often have been translated as folly, since Erasmus wrote his ironic elegy. Stultitia has as much to do with folly as with stupidity. As the aphorist Chamfort said 2 centuries ago, 3/4 of folly is just stupidity. For the ancients and the European greats, folly stood in opposition to wisdom and reason, but it was not the counterpart or the absolute opposite of reason. The fool loves to reason, and often reasons too much. As Chrysaor says in Molière's The Learned Ladies, reasoning banishes reason. The fool is not merely a Minus Habens, a moron. He's someone who goes too far, who exceeds the bounds of sense, and from there, of propriety in the realm of wit. He's both irrelevant and impertinent. The concept of stupidity as a surfeit of reason was put forward by the great moralists of the French Enlightenment, from La Bruyère to Vauvenargues, as well as by master satirists like Swift and Voltaire. But with those two, this surfeit was always denounced in the name of the proper use of reason, which they held to be a law of nature, destined to correct deceitful flights of fancy. The Romantics, on the other hand, exalted the power and worth of feeling, and rejected cold reason. Not only did they let themselves be beguiled by folly, they defined reason itself as stupidity. Kant held that reason, when it attempts to reach beyond experience, inevitably strays into illusion. Schopenhauer, then Nietzsche, both embraced the notion that reason was irrational by its very nature, and therefore stupid. It is reason itself that's the fool, as the French journalist and writer Georges Picard put it. The great 19th century writers on stupidity, Flaubert first among them, would revisit this theme. Flaubert's Hamis, Bouvard, and Pécuchet, and through them the wider bourgeoisie, are extremely rational. But they take it too far. With them, will always ends up defeating reason, though not for any lack of the latter. In his great book on stupidity, Breviaire de la Bêtise, Alain Roger explored the theme of sufficient reason. The self-sufficient, arrogant fool believes that reason solves everything. Stupidity, in his judgment, embodies the basic principles of logic, the law of the excluded third, contradiction, and identity, while making them ridiculous. The fool would like all propositions to be true or false. He cannot tolerate contradictions, and above all, he abounds in tautologies. Flaubert and Bloy in particular focused on this defining characteristic of bourgeois stupidity, which revels in clichés and truisms. Here the vanity of the fool reemerges, the self-satisfied tautology, meaningless because it is always true. People resort to tautologies when they have nothing relevant or meaningful to say except to recall a thing's relation to itself. A penny is a penny, a woman is a woman. To come full circle, Georges Brassens nailed this tendency with the lyric, "When you're dumb, you're dumb." Here, the production of tautologies comes close to hogwash, which, despite its emptiness, flaunts itself without shame, full of itself. It's also the hallmark of a specific form of obstinate stupidity, in its essence authoritarian, which is best exemplified by military stupidity. The era of mass stupidity. cliches are thoughts shared by everyone, those expressed by crowds, as opposed to the thoughts of the individual, which romantics believe to be uniquely capable of fighting the depersonalized mass mind incarnated by reason and technology in the name of art. But in the 20th century, and still more so in the 21st, even art has become stupid and false, as in kitsch, a form of folly applied to beauty, a corruption of aesthetic judgment. But most of all, stupidity is ceasing to be characteristic of a particular type of individual, as it was in the 17th and 18th centuries, and is truly becoming a collective, mass phenomenon. The production of hogwash, which already was endemic in the press, has lately become pandemic across all media, on the internet and on social networks, which broadcast it in such massive doses that hogwash has become a political force. Hogwash belongs to what we call the post-truth era, which should more properly be called the hogwash era, the production of a type of discourse and thought in which nobody tries anymore to find out if what's being said is true. All that counts is the effect it produces. Hogwash is both stupid, because it's out of control, and powerful, because it can be put in service of political strategies and propaganda. If the origins of stupidity and folly lie in the excesses of reason, how can we trust reason to fight them? That's the dilemma that all the great thinkers have confronted, from Nietzsche to Heidegger, from Sartre to Foucault, who accuse reason and the Enlightenment of producing mass culture, unreasoning technologies, and totalitarianism. They often have solved this dispute by championing irrationality, like the Romantics. But the cure for the disease of stupidity is not to abandon reason. It is to adopt a self-critical form of reason that is conscious of its own limitations. To be human is to be easily fooled. Jean-François Marmion, psychologist and associate editor of Sciences Humaines. If you are unaware of Homo economicus, hurry to bump into him while he still exists. Until the turn of the century, he was the model of the autonomous individual, defined by the expected utility of his choices, that is, by acting in his own best interests, especially financially. Egotistical, rational, and consistent. The acme of neoclassical economics. It was simple. It was beautiful. It was not real. Get thee behind me, economicus. For a long time, psychologists themselves have been divided on the utility of this model. It's doubtful that psychoanalysts, always inclined to hunt for buried drives and unconscious motivations, the dark side of things, were disposed to bring skepticism to a concept thought to be so clever and clear-sighted. But there were those, starting with cognitive scientists, who believed that human thought functioned like a computer, using algorithms to process information. Some models from the 1980s portrayed human beings as manipulators of formal rules or representations. Since the 1960s, other cognitive scientists had also been chipping away at Homo economicus, among them Peter Wason, a pioneer in the psychology of reason, with his selection tasks. In one of Wason's selection tasks, for cards can be used to demonstrate the variables. Each one is marked by a letter on one side and a number on the other, for example D, F, 7, and 5. How does it work? Which cards must you turn over to verify the following rule? If there is a D on the face of a card, there is a 7 on the back. However you tackle the problem, there can be only one correct response from a logical perspective. You must turn over the D and the 5. In other words, you must seek a way to disprove the rule, not to confirm it. Otherwise, you fall into confirmation bias. Wouldn't you know? Of course, 80% of us didn't know, and had no intuition about it. We fooled ourselves without being able to avail ourselves of the excuse that we were distracted by emotion. There's no harm in that, because, quite simply, contrary to the theory that explains Homo economicus, we are neither logicians nor natural statisticians. Homo economicus suffered his most devastating blow in 2002, when the Israeli-American psychologist Daniel Kahneman received the Nobel Prize in Economics. At the beginning of the 1970s, in work he conducted with his colleague Amos Tversky, who died in 1996, he brought to light the intuitive reasoning that people bring to their daily lives, heuristics. Heuristics resemble logic much as monopoly money resembles real currency. They're rough and approximate, but they work well enough in everyday life. We can use them without doing much damage, because they spare us the labor of meticulous and conscientious reasoning that might be more precise, but would exhaust and paralyze us. After this Nobel was awarded, Homo economicus, now publicly repudiated, lost his luster, and the path was cleared for a new discipline, behavioral economics, which has become very popular, particularly in times of crisis, when traditional economic models don't apply. This time around, reasoning and decision-making are being examined not in disembodied situations, but in realistic settings and an experimental context. The results do not flatter us. Nothing but biases guides our choices. We're all short-term reasoners and decision-makers. Tracking our flawed reasoning has become an Olympic sport in social and cognitive psychology, as well as in neuroscience, with ever more embarrassing consequences for the stature of human rational powers. For example, the social psychologist Solomon Asch has demonstrated that the impulse to conformity leads us to deny our own perceptions. If you're the only one in a group who recognizes that two lines are of the same length, you're likely to deceive yourself on purpose, so you can embrace everyone else's opinion in good faith. In 2005, the researcher Gregory Burns of Emory University in Atlanta repeated Asch's experiment using MRI scans. What did he find? When the brain refuses to accept evidence, the neural area that comes into play isn't the specialized section that deals with cognitive conflicts, it's the part that controls spatial perception. Other people's judgment transforms our perception of lines. Something we formerly considered an aberration proves to be a truth that we can't override. The gist: an error is not merely a superficial opinion, it transforms our perception of reality. It blinds us, or in any case, it clouds our vision. Got it? The literature about our infernal biases and misguided heuristics abounds. Sometimes we're given dire warnings. Stop fooling yourselves, declares the Swiss writer Rolf Dobelli, hoping to help us dodge the booby traps of our daily reasoning, especially the ones set by economists and journalists. Fool yourself and heaven will help you. The journalist Catherine Schultz takes an opposing position in being wrong, adventures in the margin of error. You've made a mistake, so what? Mistakes can be creative and instructive, all you have to do is learn from them. Clearly, this debate is not of interest only to psychologists and economists. So, should we give up on being rational, make peace with our folly, and hail our weaknesses as good fortune? Maybe all three at once. In his book Thinking, Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman states that we reason at two speeds. Thinking fast, which the Nobel Prize laureate calls System 1, is the heuristic zone. This is automatic pilot. You think poorly but quickly, doing as much as you can with what's in front of you, on the spur of the moment, and then you move on to other things. You categorize the world in broad strokes, you make guesses, and you botch things. Often this works, but sometimes it doesn't. That's when thinking slow, System 2, comes in. Powerful, precise, and subtle, it's capable of flights of mental gymnastics. It's not to be taken lightly. It abhors sweeping generalizations. It focuses, it pauses, it proceeds at a slow pace. It has only one flaw: it's lazy. While the hyperactive System 1 steers the chaotic ship through the course of events, System 2 just floats along. If you hit the rapids, it will take the helm, but it will monopolize your attention, burning up great amounts of energy. There's a cost to quality. In short, thanks to System 2, when you want to reason, you can. A little, but you hardly ever want to. Even then, you almost never come close to the infallibility of glacial, formal logic. Herbert Simon, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1978, suggested that while we are definitely endowed with rationality, it's a limited rationality. And this is what has permitted us to survive as a species. If our ancestors had assumed the pose of Rodin's The Thinker every time they had to decide whether to flee a predator or an enemy, humanity would have become extinct a long time ago. It was necessary for System 1, however flawed, to exist. However often we muse on System 1 and deplore its failings, we still have the deluxe parallel System 2 to fall back on, which we sparingly deploy. Given that austere logic is not our natural element, we are furnished with multiple registers of imperfect reasoning adapted to our condition, which permit us to survive in a complex, unstable, and uncertain environment. So yes, it's true, to err is human. Indeed, we probably owe a large part of our humanity to error. Let justice do its work. After a lunch break, or even a short recess, magistrates approve 65% of parole applications. Afterward, as time passes, the judges gradually become harsher and harsher until they turn down practically everything en bloc. After the next recess, they rise again to the threshold of 65% leniency. This was the finding of a 2011 analysis of nearly 1,000 decisions made by 8 Israeli magistrates. The proportion of yeas and nays depends on whether the magistrates are full or hungry. J. F. M. Brain's natural logic. We translate the elements of a problem into propositional logic, which is to say, into abstract formulations, independent of our experience and out of context, in this manner: if A, then B, or A equals B. And also, if A, then B, then non-B equals non-A, etc. Chang and Holyoake's theory of pragmatic schemas of reasoning. We make rational decisions based on conditional knowledge, acquired through experience, of the if-then variety. In such contexts, the logic goes, if this, then that, or not. For example, if a car is approaching quickly, then I won't cross the street. Johnson Laird's theory of mental models. We do not make rational decisions through simple logical rules, but through representations, which we illustrate with examples or counterexamples. J. F. M. Critique of the Pure Reasoner. The mythic Homo economicus was supposed to practice pure logic. He reasoned through acts of deduction that were predicated on starting points, premises, presented as certain, in order to reach a reliable conclusion. Once they had established this, the theoreticians of Homo economicus completely neglected other types of reasoning practiced by human beings, like inductive reasoning, through which we draw general laws from partial observations, which is to say, in a state of uncertainty. This is what Jean-François Bonnafon explains in his book Le Raisonneur et ses modalités. Bonnafon, director of research at the Toulouse School of Economics and the recipient of a bronze medal from the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, writes, "Deduction represents only an infinitesimal fraction of our reason, complicated by all sorts of parameters, such as our preferences, what we would like to see happen, and what we would like to be true. For a long time, we've studied how reason is affected by intangible facts, without trying to find out if these facts were desirable or whom they served. We acted as if people always reasoned for the sheer pleasure of it, with no practical goal. Whereas, in fact, we do not reason only to achieve a particular goal, we also are capable of doing so while incorporating the presumed goals of others. When we reason about other people, we take into account that we are thinking about what they want. Even if we'd like to keep on reasoning through deduction, we can't. Very simply, this is because we rarely can anchor our reflections on absolutely certain premises. We knew that people were capable of coping with uncertainty, but we thought it was a marginal consideration, Jean-François Bonnafon explains. Furthermore, more and more researchers suggest that the opposite is true, that the time we devote every day to deduction and to the processing of reliable information is secondary. The fundamental, true human capacity is for managing uncertainty. Deduction represents only a small portion of our activity. If you're capable of reasoning while taking uncertainty into consideration, you're capable of doing it with certainty. He who can do more can do less. This is the source of theories that attempt to explain the utility of more rather than less. Unrealistic theories treat human beings like disembodied objects that take no interest in mistakes or in failures of reasoning. In an ideal world, hypotheses about human rationality would be as neatly laid out as a meticulously landscaped French garden. In the real world, human reason is like the trees that hide the forest. J. F. M. Common biases. There are dozens of ways to think, and we humans use all of them. Here are some of the biases and heuristics that have been identified by the scientific community. Heuristic of representativeness, the case of Linda. A classic from Teen Kahneman and Tversky. Linda is 30 years old, single, bright, and engaging. Which is more probable? That she would be employed by a bank? That she would be a feminist? That she would be employed by a bank and be a feminist? Nearly all of us lean toward the third hypothesis, which seems most realistic, given what we think we know about bank employees and feminists. But that's illogical, because whatever Linda's attributes may be, from a statistical standpoint, Linda is this will always be more probable than Linda is this, and also that. Heuristic of anchoring adjustment, a bad mooring in the fog. Pick a number at random, then estimate how many member states are in the United Nations. The higher the number you picked, the higher the number of states you will enfold into the United Nations. When we're in doubt, we cling to any reference point, even one generated by chance, to make our assessments, even if it has nothing to do with the question that preoccupies us. This is a mooring that, paradoxically, directs us to itself, not toward the truth. Heuristic of availability, the loudest voice is right. We extrapolate from memories that have made the strongest mark in our imagination, or simply from our most recent memories. When a schizophrenic commits a murder, that information sticks in our minds, and even if we know nothing about schizophrenia, we conclude that all schizophrenics are dangerous. Nobody talks about trains that arrive on time, so therefore they're all late. Loss aversion, a bird in the hand versus two in the bush. The thought of losing $100 moves us twice as much as the thought of winning $100. Loss aversion is at the heart of perspective theory, one of the theories elaborated by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. That's why investors often wait too long and sell at a loss. Additionally, we're more easily persuaded by an argument like, don't let your buying power decline, then increase your buying power. Work to earn more? No, work to lose less. Framing bias, half empty or half full. You're given the choice between two planes. The first has a 97% chance of landing safely. The second has a 3% chance of crashing. Which one do you board? Spontaneously, you would tend to choose the first plane even though the risks are equivalent for the two flights. This is how framing affects our judgment. Confirmation bias, blinkers or nothing. It's cliché. We retain things that confirm our vision of the world, and we minimize or reject anything that might prove that our vision is wrong. Examples: I'm conservative. I read the Wall Street Journal, of course. I'm liberal. The Nation. I believe in astrology. I exult over the 3 astrologers who predicted that a plane would crash in the United States in September 2001. Were you surprised by the results of the congressional elections? Not at all, responds the political analyst. It couldn't have gone any other way. And then he'll list in good faith all the facts or general tendencies that logically led to the current situation, which he had never previously stated. The implication is that fate has a user's manual, you'd just forgotten to decode it in time. Authority bias, the white coat effect. One morning, an unknown man dressed in a Napoleon costume warned passersby that a UFO had just flown over their city. He offered them masks to shield them from potentially harmful extraterrestrial emanations. In the afternoon, he did the same thing, but this time, dressed in a white lab coat. In your opinion, in which case would passersby hesitate? In the presence of an expert, people become meek. The social psychologist Stanley Milgram famously demonstrated this phenomenon in 1960 in an experiment in which ordinary people consented to electrocute strangers in order to please a pseudoscientist. Convenience bias. I was born, it's Voltaire's fault. When I succeed, it's because I'm good. When I fail, it's other people's fault or a question of circumstance. This attitude should not be confused with basic attribution error, by which we hold other people responsible for their behavior, regardless of external factors. For example, we assume that a person who reads a speech by Fidel Castro because he is required to do so must actually agree with what he's reading. The illusion of causality, storks, and babies. Just because 2 events are simultaneous doesn't mean that they're connected. If you observe a rise in the number of storks and the number of babies, there is no cause and effect link. Yet the illusion of causality gives rise to thorny debates. For instance, over the last 20 years, the marked increase of autism cases has coincided with the rise of the Internet. Therefore, the Internet must cause autism. This offhand observation, made by the researcher Susan Greenfield at Oxford University, has earned her no small share of sarcastic remarks. The halo effect. In for a penny, in for a pound. You know, you have beautiful eyes. So it follows that you must be kind, intelligent, and honest, and also, you have no underarm odor. Absurd? Recognizing any quality in a person predisposes you to attribute many others to them. At school, it's easier for a more physically attractive pupil to get good grades, because he's assumed to be smarter and more conscientious. Yes, that's horrible. Especially if you're not good-looking. J.F.M. Stupidity and Cognitive Bias. Eva Drozda-Sinkowska, professor of social psychology at the University Paris Descartes. Like most authors who have written about stupidity, I begin with a confession. I accepted the invitation to write this article after an extremely animated discussion with friends about the proposed title, which bothered me. I thought the juxtaposition of stupidity and cognitive bias introduced the risk that readers might associate the two. 2 ideas formed distinctly in my mind. The first was that stupidity is a term that qualifies an act or a word more pejoratively than foolishness. Given the power of this qualifier, its use should be firmly regulated and self-regulated. 2. If I say I've done a stupid thing, in principle I have no intention of doing that thing again. I'm ashamed. The power of this word intrigued me. But since French is a foreign language for me, I didn't detect the same vulgarity in the word connery that I could tell attached to the word con. And in my field, though people are very particular about word choice, quelle connerie is said a lot. The second was my conviction that cognitive biases absolutely must not be described as stupid things. They designate different tendencies in reasoning and in receiving information tied to our multiple violations of the rules of logic, probability theory, and so on. They're highly functional shortcuts, or short circuits, that sometimes lead us to make mistakes. Biases in receiving information don't indicate a lack of intelligence. They reflect the extraordinary power of our habits of thought, formed through our actions, and they do not serve pure reflection. In that sense, they bear witness to our nearly chronic underuse of our aptitudes, knowledge, and skills. We are unaware of our biases in the moment, even if we know what they are, and we only recognize them after the fact. For those who have studied them, they reveal the defects of doubt, not an inability to doubt. Stupidity and predictive judgment. Take the example of predictive judgments. Their importance has been proved. Without them, our existence would be very difficult, even impossible. At the same time, in spite of this or because of it, we often formulate predictive judgments by disregarding relevant information in favor of information that, theoretically, is much less pertinent. To crown it all, we're unaware of our own ignorance. In other words, we deceive ourselves by believing we're right. At first glance, we're not far removed from stupidity. Consider the task known as lawyers and engineers. Imagine you're told that psychologists have interviewed 70 engineers and 30 lawyers. Afterward, they wrote reports that summarized each of the 100 interviews. Drawing one of these reports randomly, you read, John is a 39-year-old man. He is actively involved in local politics. His favorite hobby is collecting rare books. He likes competition and debate, and he expresses himself very well. The great majority of people would say there's a 90% chance that John is a lawyer, not an engineer. But the correct answer is 30%. Why? To estimate the probability that John is a lawyer, we need two types of information. One of them relates to the a priori probability of lawyers existing in the sample group. The other relates to the probability that the characteristics evoked in the report describe a lawyer. The first piece of information is provided to us. There are 30 lawyers in the sample group of 100 interviewees. Therefore, the probability that John is a lawyer is equal to 30%. The second piece of information has not been provided. Theoretically, faced with this unknown, a person could adopt one of the two following positions. 1. Since this information has not been provided, it is not relevant. 2. A constant is involved, which is, the probability that the characteristics evoked by the report describe a lawyer is the same as the probability that they describe an engineer, so knowing this probability would change nothing. Obviously, very few people would do that. And for good reason. John has all the characteristics of a lawyer. An engineer would be described differently. This conviction makes the unknown appear perfectly known. It's true that Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman intentionally wrote their description of John to reinforce the impression that he must be a lawyer. The text resorts to a common stereotype of lawyers as a professional category. This should not keep us from questioning the ease with which most of us fall into the trap of privileging the individualizing information in the description at the expense of the information we have about the a priori probability. Without going into details, it seems quite clear that our conviction of the correctness of our stereotype of a lawyer counts for a lot. If, without questioning it, we compare the stereotype's content with John's characteristics, we'll see immediately that he has the typical characteristics of lawyers, that he's representative of this category. Thus, it becomes almost certain that he must be a lawyer, not an engineer, even if lawyers represent a minority in the sample group. In technical terms, we would say that resorting to the heuristic of representativeness is the origin of a bias that leads here to the neglect of information on a priori probability and the privileging of individualizing information. Like other heuristics, the heuristic of representativeness is an efficient mental shortcut. It authorizes us to make an assessment, certainly false in theory, which is acceptable because it's shared by a great number of people. Resorting to this heuristic, which we unknowingly put into effect, allows us to simplify the problems we need to resolve and to remove the uncertainty that surrounds them. At the same time, as we have just seen, this gain comes at a cost: stupidity and hypothetico-deductive reasoning. Does this example of predictive judgment bias illustrate stupidity in the sense of intellectual inadequacy? I don't think so, though I'm convinced it is one of many manifestations of an inherent flaw in the questioning process that leads us to seek confirmation of our thoughts instead of challenging them. To better understand this propensity, let's tackle Peter Wason's task 2, 4, 6. It seems quite unremarkable and incredibly easy, up until the moment when you discover that you got it wrong. This illustrates another well-known propensity, encapsulated by the expression, "Nothing's so easy that it can't be made hard." Imagine you're asked to deduce the rule that produces the following series of numbers, 2, 4, 6. To test whether the rule you've come up with is correct, you are asked to propose alternate 3-number sequences. Each time you do so, you'll be told whether your proposal is compatible with the rule or not, and if the rule you chose is in fact the rule that was applied. More likely than not, like most people, you'll first come up with the idea that it must be a series of even numbers increasing in intervals of 2. So, you'll propose the sequence August 10th, 12, in accordance with your theory. You'll be told that the series you proposed is compatible with the rule that was used, but that the rule that was used was not the one you chose. Then you'll propose another trio of numbers, for example, 8-42-56, telling yourself that the rule must simply involve rising even numbers. You'll be told the same thing as before. After the third or fourth try, you'll suggest, for example, the series 7-36-673, thinking it must have to do with numbers increasing in value, period. This time, you'll be told that your example is compatible with the rule, and that the rule that was applied is indeed the one you chose. At last you got the right answer. But you didn't go about it the fastest way. Few people choose it. It consists not of confirming your idea, but of challenging it. To accomplish this, it would have been enough to propose the series 357 to test the hypothesis of rising even numbers. But it's hard to make ourselves challenge our ideas rather than confirm them, particularly in this task. To propose a series of numbers that contradicts the idea you already have in mind seems absurd, even perverse. Doing so would force you to put your idea in doubt. If, from the outset, we were capable of doubting our ideas, we would be less convinced of the correctness of our stereotype about lawyers, and would find it easy to imagine that an engineer might also take an interest in local politics, express himself well, and collect books. Contrary to the lawyer's and engineer's task, the 2-4-6 task carries little information. Thus, it requires us to draw on everything we do know, from the fact that even numbers are involved to the fact that the numbers are rising. Easy to memorize, those 3 numbers indelibly imprint themselves in our minds, present and available at all times. The heuristic of availability means that a small amount of information overwhelms the rest, leading us into the trap of confirmation bias. While both of these examples illustrate our tendency to seek confirmation of our pre-existing ideas, the 2-4-6 task also exposes our tendency to formulate hypotheses that are specific rather than general. The latter often seems too simple and/or obvious to us to merit mention. To immediately say it must have to do with rising numbers, even if we think that's true, would sound stupid, not to say idiotic. This tendency to seek out complicated answers makes us excellent targets for jokes. For instance, why does a fireman wear red suspenders? To hold his pants up. Distracted by thoughts of civil service, we realize too late that a fireman, like anyone else, needs suspenders just to hold up his pants. This strikes us as a great joke and fine proof of foolishness. We break out laughing, realizing we've been caught in a dummy trap. Bullshit, a healthy term. I side with those who say that ignorance is not stupidity. Ignorance is a strong engine of knowledge, provided that you know you're ignorant and that you know what you don't know. But we are unaware of most of the biases that affect our reception of information and of the propensities that sway our reasoning. The problem, and it's a serious one, is that even after these biases are exposed, they continue to work. All the more so in situations that are not conducive to doubt. Whereas stupidity, true stupidity, is the hallmark of a frightening intellectual complacency that leaves absolutely no room for doubt. As Harry Frankfurt explains in his book on bullshit, this form of stupidity is worse than lies, because people who talk bullshit are uninterested in the truth. To fight bullshit, we have to denounce it, and to call it out for what it is. Therefore, there's no harm in using the term bullshit when you detect it in yourself. If it reflects genuine shame at a lapse in reasoning, it's a sign of conscientiousness, and therefore a beginning to self-regulation. And there's no harm in using it on others either. Deploying the term in a joking tone, as an ironic provocation, can serve as a warning, a pointed invitation to recognize a flaw in order to correct it. Thinking, fast and slow. A conversation with Daniel Kahneman, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics and emeritus professor of psychology at Princeton University. Q. You write that human beings have 2 ways of reacting to information, a fast way that you call System 1, and a slow way that you call System 2. How are they different? A. The 2 systems are complementary. When someone asks us what the capital of England is, a word automatically comes to mind with no effort or intention, thanks to System 1. System 1 produces interpretations of the world, of desires, of impressions, that become beliefs, which are decisions that are approved by System 2. System 2 is more complex. It controls thought and behavior. Unlike System 1, System 2 doesn't have direct, automatic access to the memory. It's much too slow. And if it's slow, that's because in general it follows a deliberate train of thought. For example, to follow the rules that allow us to solve a complicated multiplication problem. It requires effort, which gives us the impression that we are the authors of our actions. I'm the one who's acting, I'm the one who's thinking. We subjectively identify with System 2. We think our beliefs are determined by arguments and by proofs, even though that does not reflect our mental life. Q. Could it be said that System 1 simplifies reality in order to simplify our lives? A. I don't know if it's doing it in order to simplify our lives, but it certainly does simplify reality, and that it produces cognitive biases. That said, System 2 can also make mistakes. If I believe certain things that are false, or if I'm incapable of understanding the theory of relativity, that's due to the weaknesses of System 2. System 1, as I understand it, has to do with emotions, because they're produced automatically, without intention, and reflect pure subjectivity. System 2 accepts them or doesn't. But be careful, while System 1 is emotion, it's also a lot more than that. It's connected to the interpretation of life, to perception, most of our actions. And System 2 does much more than reason. It also fulfills the function of control, which is no less important. Q. In what circumstances does System 2 need to override System 1? A. When you find yourself with no solution when you're confronting a problem, or when you're in conflict between two contradictory impulses. Also, if you're in the process of violating rules of logic or behavior, or when you're surprised, then you've got to concentrate, to produce a certain mental effort. But there's nothing abrupt about it. It's a continual back and forth, thanks to certain areas of the brain that specialize in this conflict. Q. What areas of the brain are connected to the two systems? A. I don't think System 2 corresponds to any specific area, even though it does have a strong connection to the prefrontal lobe. But I wouldn't like to discuss things I know too little about. Q. At this very moment, you're using your System 2 to answer my questions with precision, but you're using your System 1 when you answer questions quickly on the subjects you're most familiar with. Does that sound right? A. My System 1 produces answers quickly, and my System 2 verifies them. At the moment, it's working very hard to monitor my French. Q. To understand this better, how would it affect our daily life if we lived only with System 1, or only with System 2? A. If we only lived with System 1, we would be much more impulsive. We would say everything that comes into our minds, like children. Think of the state of drunkenness, for example, in which System 2 is weakened. But social life wouldn't be compromised. Animals sometimes have a very advanced social life, and I don't think they have a System 2. And if, on the contrary, we only lived with System 2, our daily life would look like nothing at all. We would be inferior computers. Q. When we dream, are we entirely in System 1? A. Frankly, I don't know. I don't understand dreams. Of course, in one sense, we would be in System 1, because we dream without intention. But on the other hand, you can dream that you're reasoning. Q. What about artistic inspiration, or intuition? A. That comes from System 1, but it's fed by intentions. System 2 is entirely capable of intentionally searching the memory, which sometimes produces inspiration and intuition in an autonomous manner when we're not even looking for them, as when the mathematician Henri Poincaré suddenly solved a problem as he climbed from one step to the next while boarding a bus. Q. You say that System 1 is always searching for meaning in our experiences. Do we have an aversion to chance? A. To uncertainty, in any case. To tell the truth, people don't really acknowledge the existence of chance. We're continually in the process of creating stories, interpretations of what surrounds us, which is largely the work of System 1. System 2, on occasion, makes this conscious and adopts it. Q. Can psychopathologies be provoked by an imbalance between the two systems if we rely too much on System 1 or System 2? A. Certainly. If someone chronically criticizes himself to the point that he becomes paralyzed, he's stuck in System 2, which System 1 can't hold in check. System 1 also can produce pathologies of its own, like obsession. It includes everything that we do quickly because we've done it a lot. It's the system that lets us drive a car, that chooses our words when we think, and that therefore determines the image we have ourselves, which is an integral part of memory, of the stories we tell ourselves. It isn't System 2 that imposes that on us. Q. What psychotherapeutic techniques might work on System 1 and System 2? A. I have the impression that cognitive therapy is entirely oriented toward re-educating System 1, while reining in certain behaviors of System 2. But I don't know enough about that to give you precise details. Q. Your work on heuristics has shown that our representations of Homo economicus are largely false. Yet democracy itself was founded on the idea that a citizen is capable of rationally weighing the pros and cons before casting a vote. Is it System 1 or System 2 that underlies our political convictions? A. It's mostly System 1. Our political beliefs are not determined by arguments. We believe them because we believe in certain people whom we love and trust. It's chiefly emotion that controls political life, but I'm not sure that the fiction of the rational human is all that central to democracy. A democracy doesn't need perfect rationality to function. It's enough for people to vote for what generally, and with no guarantee, serves their interests. Where democracies have trouble is when they deal with abstract, distant threats. If the climate does in fact change, that's going to be very difficult to solve through democracy. System 1 does not respond to distant threats. You can't mobilize public action without a lot of emotion, and you can't stir up emotion when threats aren't concrete. You'd need to find a way to engage System 2 instead. Only System 2 can recognize a devastating threat, a point of no return, before you can see much evidence of it. Q. In your book Thinking, Fast and Slow, you raise the ideas of the nudge, a kind of libertarian paternalism that actively helps people make good decisions. Would this be a viable and sufficient means of getting the same results we might see if we mobilized System 2? A. It's viable and important in cases where it can be used to protect people from themselves and from stupid things they've done without reducing their freedom. But for a lot of problems, it wouldn't be sufficient. If climate change is real, it's hard to see how a nudge could implement the necessary social and economic changes. It's System 1 that needs to step in. The point is to facilitate the best decision-making for an individual without forcing the question, because System 1 doesn't care about the distant future. You can't count on rational behavior. When you have to plan for retirement when you're 25, you don't have the impression that it will ever happen to you personally. Q. You were awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, though you are a psychologist. Would you support the creation of a Nobel Prize in Psychology to bring more recognition to the discipline? A. No, not really. It seems to me that when it comes to influencing the political and social spheres, psychologists should have more weight than economists. And that's already the case. The Sarkozy Commission on Happiness, for example, or again, nudge theory, have already gone on the books as psychological factors that are able to counteract some economic limitations. Also, I have the impression that the Nobel Prize doesn't add much to human happiness. The suffering of those who wait for one in vain is more important than the joy of those who get one. Q. What goals should psychology set itself today? A. I don't think we ought to set goals for science. It would be a futile exercise, because we have no idea what will happen. All we can say is that, for the next 20 years at least, psychology will be dominated by the study of the brain, because that's what interests today's students the most, and thus, tomorrow's professors. It's not up for discussion, it's a fact. This research is very expensive, and it attracts the majority of available funding, which doesn't always make my psychologist colleagues happy. Some of them complain bitterly about it. Nevertheless, it's the most exciting thing that's happening in psychology. Trends are generally guided by technology. Not only don't we know where cerebral imaging will lead us, we know even less what the technology of the future will bring. But this is what will guide psychology. There's no doubt of that. Interview by Jean-Francois Marmion. The nudge. In French, they call it the elbow jab. Finger jab comes closer. The nudge, also known as libertarian paternalism, is an idea put forth by Richard Thaler, a professor of economics at the University of Chicago and a 2017 Nobel laureate in economics, and Cass Sunstein, professor of law at Harvard University and former advisor to President Barack Obama, as head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Administration. This approach advocates the creation of environments that encourage citizens to adopt positive behaviors while granting them the freedom of refusal. A few examples: instituting pension plans for employees, or presetting photocopiers so they print two-sided copies to save paper, or painting alternating steps of public staircases black and white, so people move up and down them faster. F. M. Kahneman and Tversky, A Beautiful Friendship. It's not by chance that Daniel Kahneman dedicated thinking, fast and slow, to Amos Tversky, whose life's work his book recapitulates, from the introduction all the way to the end of the book. The former offers incessant homage to the latter. It was on a lucky day in 1969 that the inseparable duo first met. Daniel Kahneman, then 35, a professor of psychology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, invited his colleague, 3 years younger, to speak at a seminar. He was brilliant, voluble, and charismatic, Kahneman writes. He was also blessed with a perfect memory for jokes and an exceptional ability to use them to make a point. There was never a dull moment when Amos was around. Both of them confessed that, in spite of their constant work with statistics, they were unable to predict a large portion of the results of their experiments. Consulting with senior statisticians, they learned that their colleagues had the same experience. Almost 30 years of joint work on questions of judgment and decision-making would follow, exceeding the bounds of the field of psychology. Both men left Israel in 1978 to teach in the United States, at different universities. Some of the high points of their collaboration include an influential article published in Science magazine in 1974 that presented heuristics and prospect theory, which they proposed in 1979 to explain why loss aversion led economic actors to apply bias to their transactions. In 1980, the economist Richard Thaler was inspired by their work to lay the foundation of behavioral economics, which emphasizes the human factor in economic decision-making and outcomes. In his best-selling 2008 book Nudge, co-written with Cass Sunstein, Thaler recommended the study of humans, fallible in their decisions, over the study of disembodied agents he called econs. Daniel Kahneman received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 for his work. It was an award he would have shared with his friend and collaborator Amos Tversky had Tversky not died in 1996 at the age of 59. Until geography made it too difficult to go on, Kahneman later wrote, Amos and I enjoyed the extraordinary good fortune of a shared mind that was superior to our individual minds and of a relationship that made our work fun as well as productive. J. F. M. On Stupidity in the Brain. Pierre Lamarquis, neurologist and essayist. Hen Jean-Francois Marmion asked me if one day I might be interested in writing an article on the place that stupidity occupies in the brain. I was, I swear, extremely enthusiastic. I immediately accepted, without really understanding why. At first, I misunderstood and thought he meant for me to discuss, for instance, early James Bond movies and The Name of the Rose. Once I had a better grasp of the desired subject, there were the lavish honoraria to consider and the honor of being considered important by a prestigious editor. And then, there was also a challenge to meet. After adopting Mark Twain's motto, they did not know it was impossible, so they did it. I suddenly found myself thinking of Michel Audiard's line from the cult 1960s crime comedy film, Les Tontins Flingueurs, Idiots Dare Everything. That's how you know who they are. Quickly I grew demoralized, as I discovered that no neuroscience research laboratory worthy of the name seemed to have explored this phenomenon, which plays such a paramount, central role in daily life. I would have to innovate. Soon, I decided that my initial enthusiasm had to have meant something. Surely it constituted a crucial ethological indicator of my zeal for the quest for truth. Beyond that, a few memories of neuroscience and a little salutary reading might furnish the groundwork. Finally, a deplorable image came to me of a painting so disturbing that even the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who kept the original in his bathroom, covered it with a sliding surrealist panel. It was a reproduction of a famous painting by Courbet, which shows the trunk of a nude woman, legs passively splayed in the foreground, revealing her sex organs, her con, a painting that is called, as you may remember, The Origin of the World. Lacan, as he unveiled this work to prestigious visitors to his home, from Claude Lévi-Strauss to Picasso to Marguerite Duras, would say understatedly, "And now I will show you something truly extraordinary," then stealthily observe their fascination. We are all born premature, because of the physiological limitations of the female pelvis. We really ought to remain in the warmth of the womb for at least an extra 15 months before being cast into the world. The early stress we endure in infancy probably marks us for life, even if we've forgotten about it. The human brain evolved too quickly, and as a result suffers various internal wars and conflicts of interest that may explain our frequent difficulties in making decisions and our tendency to make bad ones. Apollo and Dionysus. In theory, the brain's functioning is simple. In a way, it resembles Titian's painting An Allegory of Prudence. In it, you see three heads of men at different stages of life. The painter represents the old man. He's accompanied by his son and by his adopted grandson. An inscription above them reads, in Latin, informed by the past, the present acts with prudence so his actions will not blight the future. Our brain acts like a machine that foresees the future, whose goal is to keep us alive while adapting to circumstances, a proof of its flexibility. Its posterior section contains and decodes information that is conveyed by the senses. The brain contrasts this information with the memories it has stored, then ponders, with the help of its handsome frontal lobe, the best way to handle it. The frontal lobe is the prow of our neural ship. It permits us to move forward, and its large size distinguishes us from animals and from our ancestors with the sloping foreheads. It directs us toward the best actions to take to assure our futures through what we call executive functions. This is the part of the brain that is dedicated to Apollo, the most rational, wise, and measured part, pure intellect. But life would be pretty boring if the frontal lobe always dictated our behavior. A computer could replace this venerable segment. The logician Alan Turing, who was interested in probability and dreamed of creating an artificial brain, paved the way for the development of artificial intelligence. But Dionysus is always lurking, inhabiting ancient, deep, entrenched cerebral zones, the circuits of pleasure and reward, the humid and hormonal brain that makes us want to live, the wild horse whose goals don't always match those of the horseman who's trying to tame him but is easily thrown. Mice and men both have died, frenetically trying to pleasure themselves because of these addictive circuits without which life would have no meaning. We will give no examples, and no publicity, to any famous hotel chain in particular, but a number of people whose exceptional intellectual capacities are not in question have succumbed to their impulses, ruining promising careers in a brief instant of stolen pleasure, whether for sex or for money, while behaving like fools. Margaret Thatcher and Che Guevara. Another complication undermines the meager capacities of our brain, its duplicity. It finds itself, in effect, bound to two hemispheres, which, though connected, are false twins, agreeing on nothing. The left is right-wing, conservative, calculating. Monopolizing the power of speech, it explores only half the world, the right side, of course. And if its alter ego, the right hemisphere, gives up the ghost, it shows its true nature, ignoring everything in its left visual field, bumping into doors, eating only what's on the right side of the plate, drawing only on the right half of a piece of paper, and thereby confirming the narrowness of its vision. Bereft of dreams or poetry, this worker bee does not understand metaphors. It takes a rational approach to everything. Beholding a group of stars, it sorts them into constellations. It seeks patterns, codes, and martingales in random phenomena, attaching meaning to them for reassurance, wanting to explain them in the hope of controlling them so it can assert its own hegemony, up to the point of making human sacrifices to content a great watchmaker. But its greatest crime is to constantly reign in the other hemisphere, its half-brother, the right side, the revolutionary, the poet, the leftist, the grasshopper, who knows all the songs, puts a face on spoken words, and has a holistic vision of the world, which it appreciates in all its fullness. Despite the multifaceted qualities of the right hemisphere, it is incapable of keeping a budget or putting two words together. Thatcher versus Che? This is our government, populated with extremists who are supposed to harmoniously complement each other, but who instead play tug-of-war and struggle to come up with any clearly defined decision. Idiots are toxic and we must be protected from them. Thus, all of us are fools when it comes to power. But some run more risks than others. The frontal lobe, which polices our brain and attempts to suppress conflicts, is only fully operational in adulthood, giving the younger ones among us plenty of time to externalize their impulses and weaknesses and to act like little assholes. Cerebral sclerosis lies in wait for idle folk who don't pursue an active cultural or social life, predisposing them, if they escape Alzheimer's, to become old fools, even if, as the singer Georges Brassens would have it, age has nothing to do with it. One stupidity does not discriminate based on intelligence. It's as prevalent among Nobel laureates and other members of the Academy as among anyone you might bump into at a bar. In the excellent 2017 film Goddard Mon Amour by Michel Hazanavicius, we watch the transformation of the likable young Wolfgang Amadeus Goddard into a pretentious, uptight asshole. The scene takes place in May 1968 in a villa on the Côte d'Azur, where the originator of the Nouvelle Vague has come to create a disruption at the Cannes Film Festival. This defender of the people, this would-be revolutionary, criticizes his girlfriend for her bourgeois tourist suntan and explains to his bewildered friends his radical vision of a streamlined cinema that would have no screenplay, star, or artifice of any kind. After one of his friends disloyally adds, "and no audience," the genius comes up against the common sense of the villa's gardener, who tells him candidly that he likes to go to the movies on Sunday just for fun, to marvel and to distract himself. In a luminous work, which he wrote in one night, under a pseudonym, the Italian economist Carlo Maria Cipolla explains the basic laws of human stupidity. With supporting diagrams, he demonstrates the extreme danger of stupidity. Every contact you have with an idiot speeds you both to a shared doom. An interaction between two intelligent people is productive for both parties. A thief may rob you, but he's less dangerous than a fool, because a fool takes you down with him in his downward spiral. He chops off the branch where you're sitting beside him. It's essential to recognize idiots in time to avoid disaster, but that operation is extremely perilous. In an attempt to ward off the consequences of folly, the sociologist Christian Morel gives several pointers in his work on dodging absurd decision-making. For instance, form a group of experts who respect each other, rather than a group that must submit to a boss's decisions. Avoid hierarchies or rotating pecking orders. Allow devil's advocates to encourage contradiction and questioning that stimulate crucial inquiry and restrict conformity. Give things time to develop. In short, in one way or another, foster a democratic environment in which nobody need doubt the decision-making of their representatives. But first of all, how can you be sure what kind of person you are, yourself? Whether or not you're a fool, there's always someone who takes you for one, warns the singer Pierre Perret. The simple act of asking yourself this question is a positive sign. It proves that you're capable of introspection and self-criticism, indicating highly developed cognitive capacity. The less you know, the more you are sure of, the psychiatrist and ethologist Boris Cyrulnik has observed. Reciprocity is also relevant. The more you know, the more doubts you have. The more memories you have stockpiled, the greater the store of information the brain can draw on to guide you to act prudently and competently. And if you look hard, as the Perret song goes, you're reassured whatever you do that there's always a greater fool than you. On the necessity of fools, in praise of stupidity. There's certainly a solution to this problem. On the question, where in the brain is stupidity located, the answer is, in the brain of whoever calls another person an idiot. Stupidity is manifestly necessary in the evolutionary plan, otherwise this burden would have disappeared long ago. But that has not happened, as general opinion attests. Idiots seethe and swarm among us, reproducing faster than rabbits. How do they dodge natural selection, being so poorly equipped? The evidence must be accepted. Idiots, despite their dangerousness, are absolutely necessary to human survival. Jeer at them as you may, they are the mortar that holds our society together. The brain is a social organism. To call someone an idiot is to point a finger and put a label on them. It demonstrates your own ability to detect this defect, which isn't always easy to spot at first sight, as we have shown, and which you yourself do not possess. To call someone else stupid is to call attention to your own perceptiveness, which is always flattering to the ego, placing yourself above the designated victim. As a rule, few people will contradict you, which allows you to confirm your ascendance on the lofty ladder occupied by those who share your point of view. They spare themselves mental effort by mirroring you. They will mock the sacrificial victim along with you, laughing heartily. You will be confirmed as the leader of a superior assemblage that knows how to draw a clear line between idiots and everyone else. Your expertise will spread quickly into other domains. You will be listened to, and your advice will be followed. Better still, you will be obeyed. The poor idiots you've singled out will have no choice but to flee, or to just stand by and take it. They will be forced to submit, to accept ridicule, to fulfill their role as scapegoats. Will they dare to sing under their breath the song by Georges Brassens that goes, "The plural is useless to mankind. Whenever more than four are gathered, you'll find a band of fools"? Will they console themselves by sticking pins into photographs of you and your alter egos on the wall, risking denunciation and threats from the very people who stigmatized them? A king who turns megalomaniac will try to hold onto his crown, expand his powers, and reign without giving power to those who placed him on the throne. He exploits them legitimately because they were stupid enough to prop him up. And still, so says Brassens, there's hardly any chance he'll be dethroned. There's a modern update of the Courbet painting called After the Creation, which depicts the scene after the sexual act. A new life has just been engendered through the intermediary of a Khan. The canvas recalls Michelangelo's fresco of the creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. God has made man in his own image and points to him with his index finger, but Adam makes the same gesture, indicating his creator in parallel fashion. Michelangelo endowed God with the kind of brain that could lead the first man to point at him. Is Adam trying to answer Jean-Francois Marmion's question? Are the creator and his creation both calling each other fools? Albert Camus wrote mercilessly of this in The Myth of Sisyphus: either we are not free, and God the all-powerful is responsible for evil, or we are free and responsible, but God is not all-powerful. It's up to you to draw your own conclusions as to the human estate. And here's what explains my enthusiasm at the prospect of this contribution, as well as the glee of my entourage and everyone else I talked to about it. In the absence of lofty scientific studies, it was their laughter. That gave me the key to the origin of the world, though they didn't know it. I thank them from the bottom of my heart. Band of fools. Intentional idiocy. Eve Alexander Thalmann, Doctor of Natural Science and Professor of Psychology at the College St. Michel de Fribourg. Diaki, stupidity, foolishness. There's no shortage of terms when it comes to denigrating an individual or his actions. These pejorative and often insulting words are part of everyday speech, so much so that their definition appears unequivocal to us. Stupidity means a lack of intelligence. As for knowing precisely what intelligence is, that question is more delicate, and is the subject of passionate and virulent debates, even if intuitively we think we know what it means. Just the same, all of us can think of people of notable intelligence who have committed extremely stupid acts. How is this possible? What if stupidity isn't a lack of intelligence, but a particular manner of expressing it? As a starting point, it seems judicious to me to distinguish between two terms that are often wrongly used synonymously. Certain acts produce disagreements and negative effects both on their authors and on those around them, with no net advantage for either. In such cases, you ask yourself why the person who committed them went to the trouble. If, through lack of reflection, maturity, or judgment, he didn't have the sense to anticipate the consequences of his behavior, then it must come down to foolishness, and the manner of children who dare forbidden acts as they explore the world, unaware of their potential hazards. Anything else must be a case of people committing these types of actions on purpose. How can we know that it's on purpose? For one thing, they'll acknowledge afterward that they shouldn't have done it, and that they knew very well what they were getting themselves into. For another, if you ask them to analyze similar behavior by someone else, they will conclude, "That's stupid, he shouldn't have done it." This means that stupidity is not due to a lack of reflection or to a failure to anticipate outcomes. More troubling still, stupid acts are committed by people of established intelligence. Some may have taken cognitive tests that show they have a high IQ. Some may be hailed as brilliant innovators behind a spectacularly successful enterprise. Others may have earned wide recognition for their intellectual prowess, or be recipients of prestigious diplomas. All the same, intelligent people are not immune to incredibly stupid actions that have catastrophic consequences. Consider former President Bill Clinton, who, even while he was under investigation, continued his inappropriate relationship with his intern Monica Lewinsky, which would cause him to be impeached by the House of Representatives. This shows that you can be intelligent, even very intelligent, and still act stupidly on occasion. Here's one way to summarize this asymmetry. Intelligence describes people, whereas stupidity relates to specific actions. Algorithmic intelligence versus rationality. Could it be that intelligence has not been defined exhaustively enough? Keith Stanovich, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the University of Toronto, has done significant work on this subject. He distinguishes between several levels of intelligence. Stanovich identifies what he calls algorithmic intelligence, which pertains to comprehension and to the logical combination of ideas. These are the very abilities that are measured by intelligence tests currently in use, like the famous Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, which produce the intelligence quotient. Despite the criticisms often leveled on these tools and the results they provide, it must be admitted that they fulfill their mission well. They can inform us of students' ability to perform in academic programs and help explain the difficulties certain students have with their instruction. 3. Algorithmic intelligence is measured precisely. The tests are said to have excellent psychometric properties. And that's for a reason. The test questions all come with right answers, so the test taker's results can be compared to an answer key. This is why a number can be assigned to quantify their performance. But in real life, and outside the classroom, the situation is different. There's rarely a right answer to the dilemmas we encounter. Should you accept a promotion to a job in a foreign country? Is it better to get married than to stay single? Would you be happier if you bought a Honda or a BMW? No Excel spreadsheet, however thoroughly detailed, can provide the right answer to such questions. This is why Professor Stanovich identified another level of intelligence, which he calls rationality. Rationality relates to the capacity to make decisions that help us achieve our objectives and to adopt beliefs that take reality into account. With his collaborators, he devised a test intended to measure this kind of thinking. It's not a question of comprehension in this case, but of intentionality. That's because understanding a situation does not necessarily lead to actions that reflect awareness of it. Just think of smokers who know the risks attached to cigarettes, but continue to smoke all the same. Evaluating intelligence this way, on multiple levels, sheds light on the paradox mentioned earlier. Intelligent people, which is to say, those endowed with an IQ above the norm, can do stupid things and knowingly engage in actions that offer them no benefit, even actions that present an elevated risk of damaging consequences. A second interesting aspect of Professor Stanovich's approach relates to individuals of high intellectual potential. The hip phenomenon has benefited in recent years from abundant publications that have spread the idea, prompting people to place themselves in this particular category. And yet, hip is no guarantee of superior success in life when it meets obstacles in the social and professional sphere to which it can't adapt. The concept of rationality offers an elegant interpretation. High potential relates only to algorithmic intelligence and is wholly incapable of predicting the decisions best attuned to current realities. You may drive a car that has a more powerful engine than other people's, but that says nothing about how good a driver you are or your journey's destination. So, without contradiction, it is possible to accept that an individual might be intelligent, yet simultaneously be capable of committing stupid acts. This raises a new question. What could be the motivation of acting stupidly? Many would put the blame on a lack of emotional control. From this perspective, emotions are thought to overwhelm the individual, momentarily clouding his judgment. It's a seductive theory, certainly, but it doesn't take into account cases in which the stupid act is conducted deliberately without the pretext of strong emotion. For example, consider the case of two pupils who break into their high school one night and set off two fire extinguishers. The act is stupid, and when the young people who did it are apprehended the next day, they admit it. There was no benefit at all, the consequences were severe, and therefore, their behavior was clearly not rational. Idleness and boredom were mentioned, but no other emotions. There wasn't even the motive of getting revenge on a professor or trying to get school closed the next day. Immunity bias, impunity bias, and optimism bias. Another tack that may be more useful to follow than emotions in understanding stupid decisions is cognitive bias. This field of study is well documented today in cognitive psychology. Indeed, it's responsible for the first ever Nobel Prize to go to a psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, in 2002. A cognitive bias is an error of reasoning that is systematically produced, like optical illusions, which fool you every time even if you know the trick. Consider causality bias, which leads us to see a causality link where there is no correlation. For instance, if I noticed that my cat jumped up on my lap and started purring when I was feeling anxious, I deduced that my cat sensed my state of mind and was responding to it. It's because the feline sensed my interior state from a distance that he came up to comfort me with his presence. One bias that affects stupid actions is connected with optimism. It sometimes happens that we are exaggeratedly optimistic about ourselves. We tend to think we drive better than most people, and that we have a smaller risk of getting sick or of getting divorced than statistics indicate. We live as if we were outside the common run, different from other people. As the American psychologist Daniel Todd Gilbert ironically observes, if you're like most people, you don't know that you're like most people. When the two pupils break into their high school to mess with the fire extinguishers, they're convinced that they won't get caught. And yet, they would lucidly advise anyone else against attempting this project, given its risks. This feeling of immunity, conferred by optimism bias, is reinforced by a feeling of impunity, which itself is the result of numerous life experiences that pass without incident. If you think about it, we often break the rules without paying a price for it. How many of us have exceeded the speed limit, or been late to work, or made little white lies? Doubtless the great majority. Because of these instances of unpunished transgressions, the brain, logically, determines that there's very little risk, or even no risk, of getting caught in a stupid act that has damaging consequences. The feelings of immunity and impunity are at the heart of the stupid decisions we make in daily life. How many of us manage to lead healthy lives, eating moderately, and getting enough exercise? If you think this doesn't apply to you, then you've fallen into optimism bias. You don't do all that you could, but you like to think that you won't get sick like other people. Moreover, you don't perceive for 1 second any of the potential negative consequences of the non-optimal aspects of your lifestyle. With full knowledge, you deceive yourself about your own condition. Cognitive biases are indissociable functions of intelligence. They are what permits us to economize our efforts and to make quick decisions in emergency situations. It's also been demonstrated that the most intelligent people, the ones with a higher IQ, don't do any better than anyone else on tests of the different biases. Intelligence doesn't protect us from bias or from stupid decisions, stupidity or creativity. That said, are we doomed to endure a partially biased psychological process that prompts us to make stupid decisions? Let's not forget another characteristic of stupid actions, their transgressive side. If the two aforementioned pupils had broken into their high school and decided to sweep the corridors, nobody would have described their project as stupid. Inappropriate, no doubt, but not stupid. This is because a constructive goal would have been detected. But setting off the fire extinguishers is another story. There's no constructive justification for that act, other than that it's deliciously transgressive. The pupils know they're doing something they're absolutely not supposed to do, which gives them a little thrill in the moment. Doing what you're not supposed to do is often a driver of stupidity, but also of creativity. It's precisely in leaving the beaten path and exploring avenues others haven't considered that you discover new things. It must be acknowledged that many stupid acts, sadly, are creative and original. Besides, often, when we struggle to make sense of the actions and decisions taken by the most creative minds, they don't seem far removed from what is commonly known as folly. It may be that stupidity, as examined in this essay, may be the source of many discoveries and inventions that have helped to make our world more comfortable. No doubt the propensity to transgression, supported by an optimism that favors risk-taking, has contributed to progress and discovery. By this logic, stupidity and creativity are two faces of the same coin, whose common factor is divergent thinking. That means that stupidity is much subtler than it seems. It can't be reduced to a lack of intelligence, any more than intelligence itself, IQ, can arm us against temptation. When very smart people believe very dumb things. Bridget Axelrod, Honorary Professor of Philosophy and Psychology. All the efforts in education that democratic societies have approved seem to have forgotten one essential aspect of knowledge, the critical mind, which, if exercised without method, leads easily to gullibility. Doubt has heuristic virtues, it's true, but it can also lead to cognitive nihilism rather than mental autonomy. Gerald Bronner, La Démocratie des Crédules 1. People whose intelligence seems evident sometimes provoke astonishment by embracing, in all seriousness, ideas that lack any foundation or that adhere to far-fetched theories. It's true that there is no universal definition of intelligence. The reason for this is probably that the word evokes different abilities. History provides numerous examples of individuals who were universally considered intelligent in various fields, from science and technology to the arts or philosophy. Relying on a definition of intelligence as a capacity for reasoning, planning, problem-solving, abstract thinking, understanding complex ideas, learning quickly, and learning from experience. A meta-analysis of 63 studies concluded that intelligent people are less inclined to faith than others. It seems logical, therefore, to conclude that people endowed with superior intelligence have a greater chance at defending themselves against beliefs. To define intelligences of a very high order, it's useful to consider the stunning capacity some people have exhibited to leave behind the broken paths and dominant models of their own eras, and to innovate, rather than to content themselves with the prevailing assumptions of their times. Galileo, Darwin, Einstein, and also Kant and Descartes were capable of thinking differently than others in their epoch. They cast into doubt majority opinion and simplistic explanations. Intelligence in their case was accompanied by critical thinking, the capacity to intellectually resist the dominant discussion, which was a kind of indoctrination, and all forms of dogmatism more generally. However, an article by Heather A. Butler, an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychology at California State University, explores this destabilizing phenomenon. Smart people are capable of doing and saying foolish things, and believing in inanities. She writes, though often confused with intelligence, critical thinking is not intelligence. Critical thinking is a collection of cognitive skills that allow us to think rationally in a goal-orientated fashion, and a disposition to use those skills when appropriate. Critical thinkers are flexible thinkers who require evidence to support their beliefs and recognize fallacious attempts to persuade them. Critical thinking means overcoming all kinds of cognitive biases. 3. This makes it easier to understand why even very intelligent people sometimes believe bizarre things. The sociologist Gerald Bronner, recently interviewed by Thomas C. Durand in the documentary Les Lois de l'Attraction Mentale, said that he was a millenarian early in life. "I know that you can believe in crazy things without being crazy," he said. He added that it was a series of coincidences, a series of tiny things, that led him to question this belief. But not everyone gets that chance. Jimmy Carter and his letter to extraterrestrials. In 1976, during his presidential campaign, Jimmy Carter declared, "If I become president, I'll make every piece of information this country has about UFO sightings available to the public and the scientists." He added this surprising sentence, a fine example of confirmation bias: "I am certain that UFOs exist because I have seen one." After winning the election, acting on his convictions, President Jimmy Carter sent a letter to extraterrestrials in the Voyager 1 space probe on September 5, 1977. After introducing the probe and the Earth, President Carter addressed them in this manner: "This is a present from a small, distant world, a token of our sounds, our science, our images, our music, our thoughts, and our feelings. We are attempting to survive our time so we may live into yours. We hope someday, having solved the problems we face, to join a community of galactic civilizations. This record represents our hope and our determination, and our goodwill in a vast and awesome universe." The fact that Jimmy Carter, author of many books of political literature and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002, would have had the naivete to send messages to extraterrestrials that would not arrive for 40,000 years, and that in any case we would know nothing about, since the probe will stop transmitting information after 2025, boggles the mind. But Carter is not the only one to have sent messages to extraterrestrials. On November 19, 2017, Science Post announced that a team of astronomers from SETI had sent a radio message containing information about the planets of our solar system, the structure of DNA, a drawing of a human being, and other basic information about the Earth and its inhabitants in the direction of a neighboring solar system, one of the closest ones known to contain a potentially habitable planet. Near enough that we could receive a response in less than 25 years, a much more reasonable delay, it may be admitted, even if it's not tomorrow. Still more astonishing, scientists like the physicist Stephen Hawking and the astronomer Dan Wertheimer, SETI researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, alerted the authorities to the possible repercussions of communication with extraterrestrials. As a civilization capable of receiving and understanding these messages would certainly be much older and more advanced than ours, technologically speaking. Dan Wertheimer noted, "It's like shouting in a forest before you know if there are tigers, lions, bears, or other dangerous animals there. This is extremely unsettling." On another note, very intelligent people can be blinded by their beliefs to the point that they renounce their critical thinking, sacrificing their happiness and even their lives. Steve Jobs, a brilliant visionary, blinded by his beliefs. Nicknamed iGod, the god of high-tech, Steve Jobs often evoked magical thinking, the idea that he could bend the world to his will. It bore him fruit as he brought his awesome ideas into existence, but it proved powerless against cancer. In the opinion of his biographers Daniel H. Baia and Walter Isaacson, and in light of all the creations he originated, Steve Jobs was very intelligent and even brilliant. Daniel H. Baia, a French journalist and author of Les Quatre de Steve Jobs, Biography de Steve Jobs, describes him thus: tormented, perfectionist, visited by genius and endowed with an inherent sense of beauty. Jobs was capable of big dreams and had the talent to make others share them. He was not a typical CEO, but an authentic artist perpetually in search of the Grail, an aesthete animated by one desire, to change the world. Walter Isaacson, past editor of Time magazine, past president of CNN, and author of biographies of Albert Einstein, Henry Kissinger, and Benjamin Franklin, emphasizes in his biography of Steve Jobs the short sentence that loomed large in Apple's Think Different publicity campaign: "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." Steve Jobs' biological father was Syrian, his mother was American. As an unmarried student, his mother had her son adopted at birth by the Jobs couple on the condition that they make him go to college. They were very humble people. They promised. As he grew up, Jobs was attracted by India and by Buddhism. After a hippie adolescence, then a long stay in India with a friend, he returned home and went to college, but quit after 3 months. He audited a calligraphy course, which appealed to his aesthetic sense, then spent a summer in an apple orchard, where he lived off nothing but apples. A little later, he co-founded Apple with his friend Steve Wozniak. By the age of 23, he was a millionaire. At 40, a billionaire. He surrounded himself with geniuses and knew how to get the best from them, drawing out their talents through his charisma. He came up with the brilliant ideas of Apple I, Apple II, Pixar, the iMac, the iPod, iTunes, the iPhone, the iPad, to name a few. But his life was studded with setbacks that he always moved past, going still further. Except for the last one, pancreatic cancer. After detecting a tumor in his pancreas in October 2003, doctors wept with emotion when they discovered that the tumor was operable. But Steve Jobs refused surgery. Buddhist and vegetarian, he was skeptical about medicine and believed firmly in alternative therapies, each more far-fetched than the next. He consulted healers, naturopaths, and acupuncturists, swallowed herbal capsules, drank fruit juice, and conducted long fasts. In 2004, new tests showed how little effect the dandelion salad had on the cancer cells. The tumor had spread beyond the pancreas. He accepted the operation then, but by then it was too late. In April 2009, he had a liver transplant at Methodist Transplant Institute in Memphis, Tennessee. He continued working at Apple until his death in October 2011, at the age of 56. His biographers and friends have speculated about the contradictions of his personality. A brilliant inventor who could move mountains, he was also incapable of ridding himself of claptrap notions that hastened his demise. Could the obsessive idea of being abandoned by his biological parents have created a void that he filled with esoteric inquiry? At the age of 7, he was devastated when a little girl to whom he'd confided that he was adopted said to him, "So your parents didn't love you?" His adoptive parents comforted him with the sensitivity they always showed. No doubt, the hippie counterculture environment of the Bay Area in the 1970s also fed his impulse to look elsewhere for inspiration. Galileo was wrong. The church was right. Sometimes irrational beliefs are only dangerous to those who hold them, but that's not always the case. Through influence, suggestion, and proselytizing, some people use all their intelligence to persuade susceptible souls to believe what they profess, even when they don't believe it themselves. In the documentary The Laws of Mental Attraction cited earlier, the French biophysicist Henri Brock said, "A quarter of Europeans believe that the Earth is at the center of the universe and that everything revolves around it." 10 years ago, on November 6, 2010, a supposedly scientific congress titled "Galileo Was Wrong, the Church Was Right" was held at the Hilton Garden Inn in South Bend, Indiana, less than 100 miles from Chicago. 10 panelists were presented as experts. They tried to prove that the sun revolved around the Earth, according to the geocentric system, even though science since Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton has proved that the Earth and other planets revolve around the sun, according to the heliocentric system. The subtitle was promising. It was to be the first annual Catholic conference on geocentrism. Dr. Robert Sungenis opened the conference with a speech entitled "Geocentrism. They know it, but they're hiding it," taking up a recurrent strain, conspiracy theory. Other speakers, like Dr. Robert J. Bennett and Dr. John Salza, announced similarly staggering themes: scientific proof, the Earth is at the center of the universe, introduction to the mechanics of geocentrism, and scientific experiments show the Earth is stationary at the center of the universe. Their qualifications were fuzzy. Robert J. Bennett, for example, co-organizer of the conference, declared himself a doctor of general relativity. Robert Sungenis was president of something called Catholic Apologetic International and the author of many books and articles on theology, science, culture, and politics. He had taught physics and mathematics for many years in various institutions. He preached that physicists like Albert Einstein, Ernst Mach, Edwin Hubble, Fred Hoyle, and many others had proved that, as it says in the Bible, the sun and all the planets revolve around the Earth, which is fixed in space, immobile and immutable. He nourished the hope that people would give Scripture its rightful place and understand that science wasn't what it was cracked up to be. Yet every new scientific discovery brings new proof that geocentrism does not correspond to reality. Exponents of geocentrism have nothing to back them up but the Bible. To every scientific argument they respond, it says in the Bible that Attacking Galileo tarnishes the image of one of the founders of modern science, who conducted one of the first proofs of Copernicus's heliocentrism, and it also scrubs away what some consider to be the blot caused by the Catholic Church's apology in 1992 for the condemnation of Galileo. There's been plenty of water under the bridge since Galileo. Copernican science had to take on scripture and the belief in God's revealed truth, and to wage war on the irrational. Scientists were persecuted. Today some reductionists and crackpots are trying to manipulate minds so they can pass along their hazy theories. The battle of obscurantism against the truth continues. Can anything defeat obscurantism? While it's unlikely that anyone can increase their intelligence, with proper application of method it is possible to learn how to develop your critical thinking. Not all beliefs are stupid, absurd, or dangerous. Certain beliefs are constructive, like belief in oneself and in one's capacities, in self-worth, in life, and in one another. The risk of our being so influenced by dangerous beliefs that we lose our reason comes from the need to find meaning in life, whatever the cost. When other people transmit an explanation that corresponds to our vision of the world, or that removes our need to search for it ourselves, it can be easy to adopt it. But what makes irrational beliefs so powerful is their tendency to mesh with our intuitive expectations. From the beginning of time, many people have believed bizarre things, and many people have struggled to fight against those beliefs. This creates an equilibrium that, over time, doesn't really change. In this way, you can fight for reason with the understanding that you're simply participating in a balancing act. As intelligent, cultured, and critical as a person may be, no human being is entirely free from some absurd belief, essentially because it's so difficult to accept the role of chance. Looking to destiny, fate, conspiracy, plots, and good or bad intentions to explain luck is a universal bias. Lightning doesn't strike twice. Where there's smoke, there's fire, and good things come to those who wait are all expressions that demonstrate our need for causality and meaning. The greatest scientists could not avoid it. That's why Einstein wrote in his letters about the illness of his wife, Mileva, and their son, "Well-deserved punishment for my having taken the most important step of my life so rashly. I begot children with a physically and morally inferior person." Einstein's mother had tried to dissuade him from marrying Mileva, who had a limp, predicting that his children would be affected. You might have expected more broad-mindedness from the inventor of the theory of relativity. But as two of his biographers, Roger Highfield and Paul Carter, have said, Einstein was a man whose combination of intellectual vision and emotional myopia left behind him a series of damaged lives. At root, perhaps what lies in our power is not to make fewer people believe bizarre or crazy things, but to make sure there are not more people who fall prey to them. It's very rare that anyone can succeed in changing the opinions of those who are already convinced of them. The risk is rather that by challenging them, you reinforce their beliefs. Why we find meaning in coincidences. A conversation with Nicolas Gauvret, psychologist and mathematician, professor at l'ESPE Lille Nord de France, institutional member of the University Laboratoire Cognitions Humaines et Artificielles. Certain coincidences seem so stupefying that we refuse to attribute them to chance and look for meaning in them. But you put this down to a faulty perception of context. Our vision is localized, fixed in time and space. If you look at it from a global perspective, coincidences aren't that shocking. And furthermore, for the most part, we don't ask the right questions. Take the paradox of birthdays. In a group of 25 people, what's the likelihood that 2 of them have the same birth date? In answering the question, we're tempted to rely on a heuristic, a simplified form of reasoning, and ask ourselves what the probability is that, among 25 people, 1 would share our own birthday. The result is pretty weak, because we reduce the problem to only one possible date, our own birth date. The probability that 1 person in 25 would have the same birth date as me is only 6.3%, and yet, the chance that 2 people in a group of 25 would have the same birthday is 1 in 2. But that's not at all the same question. You give the example of a woman, Violet Jessup, who survived 3 shipwrecks, including the Titanic. That may seem extraordinary, but at the end of the day, it isn't, not at all. The problem derives from the fact that we have insufficient information, and we fill in the gaps with default elements that seem probable and implicit. When we hear without any further details that someone has survived the wreck of the Titanic and 2 other shipwrecks, we imagine that the other 2 wrecks were comparable to the Titanic, which isn't at all the case, since one of them had very few victims, and the other had none at all. Moreover, you assume that there's nothing particularly unique about Violet Jessup. but she worked for the companies of all three of those ships. Q. You also say that, in attempts to decode the events of September 11th, the number 11 pops up a lot, which produces the temptation to see conspiracy or the hand of fate, but you see nothing extraordinary in it. A. This applies to all numerology and fetish numbers. The number 19, for example, appears hundreds of times in the Quran, and the number 7 in the Bible, or in any case, multiples of it, which is hardly astonishing, statistically speaking. You can also find predictions in word form, in the Bible for instance, a supposedly secret code. A few years ago, in his book The Bible Code, the journalist Michael Drosnin used a variety of reading grids to reveal all sorts of predictions, including the end of the world. In reality, the number of possible grids and computer analyses you could apply to the text is so enormous that you could find absolutely anything. Drosnin even issued a challenge: see if you can find as many predictions in Moby Dick as in the Bible. Well, it had already been done. Besides, in the Bible, applying the same technique, people have also found passages that say God doesn't exist and hate Jesus. As with anything else, you can find what you want. Q, including in your own book. 1. Definitely. In Pascal's Pensées, I found a prediction of thousands of deaths from AIDS. Sebastian Pommier, a computer scientist, found the words chicken and French fries in the genome of beer yeast when he alphabetically encoded it, which was what he'd had for lunch. If you apply one reading grid chosen at random, the probability of finding chicken and French fries is very low, but if you multiply that by a very large number of different grids, it's another thing entirely. Q, you've calculated that, over the last 20 years, 72,000 premonitory dreams might have genuinely predicted the death of someone the following week, but would have gone unnoticed. A. Yes, that's just an estimate, but it's one more illustration of the conjunction of weak probability with a large sampling. Henri Brock made a similar calculation for a television program on mystery, during which a medium asked the television audience to turn on the lights in their homes so he could make light bulbs shatter all across France. People phoned in by the dozens, aghast, to affirm that a light bulb really had burst in their homes. Incredible. But given that the program lasted an hour, and supposing that every viewer had 4 or 5 light bulbs, it was predictable that a few hundred would burn out during the program, given the average lifespan of a light bulb. The probability was very weak for each lamp, but elevated for hundreds of thousands of them. Q. He might just as well have pretended to cause births and deaths. A. Yes, but people know that things like that happen often. People don't normally talk about light bulbs exploding. The same applies to premonitory dreams. I've had quite a few myself, violent ones, which seemed real, but luckily turned out not to be. Otherwise, I'd have 2 friends less at the very least. Q. Why is it that not one single prediction of astrologists or clairvoyants ever comes true, that there's never a coincidence? A. Oh, but predictions regularly come true. Elizabeth Teissier had foreseen that something would happen in September 2001. Not an attack, and not on the 11th, but still. In general, their predictions are more foreseeable: earthquakes, accidents. But not September 11th, which was truly unexpected. Elizabeth Teissier, to justify her predictions, often declares that she foresaw airplane accidents. For fun, someone started using the computer to generate random predictions, and that turned out to be more effective, a bit, than Elizabeth Teissier. This remains a problem with anniversaries. If you make a list of dates on which accidents will occur, it's not improbable that you'll end up with 1 or 2 coincidences. Q. You attack certain psychological approaches, like psychogenealogy 2 and synchronicity. Psychogenealogy, essentially, is based on coincidences between the dates of significant events in our own lives and events that happened to our ancestors. In essence, it's a slightly more complicated variation on the birthday paradox, because this time we're looking for coincidences between 2 distinct lists. But once you start constructing an enriched, expanded genealogical tree, it's not rare to find yourself with hundreds of dates, which heightens the probability of a coincidence. Furthermore, in practice, people don't really have exact dates. In the worst case, when people really find nothing, they find a way to make up a connection. One 24-year-old patient had a great-uncle who died at 30 while traveling. A psychologist came up with a connection, telling the man that he was in a dynamic to kick off at around 30. How funny. And yes, I'm also regularly asked about the concept of synchronicity. Point 3 Jung wanted to elaborate a theory on it, with the help of mathematicians and a physicist, but it never came to anything. Q. Nevertheless, People can't stop themselves from assigning meaning to coincidences. I suppose you yourself might be tempted, in spite of everything. Absolutely. An event with a weak probability seems much more astonishing to us when it happens to us than when it happens to other people. Recently, I was testing children on their perception of luck by throwing a die behind a barrier and asking them to guess 8 times in a row what number would come up. I wanted to analyze the sequences of predictions they produced. Out of 70 children, one succeeded 4 times in a row. At the end of these attempts, I told myself, this is terrible. If this can happen, I must be wrong. Premonition does exist. I had to reason with myself, 1 out of 70, that can be explained by chance. It's like optical illusions. You fall for them in the moment, but you can reason your way out of them. There's a phenomenon called the clustering illusion, related to excessive expectation of randomness. That is to say, you expect chance to reflect the ideas you have of it. To be more specific, you expect that dates chosen at random will not be ordered in any special grouping but will be uniformly dispersed. In reality, when you choose 12 dates at random, 2 will fall in the same month, or even 3. This excessive expectation of randomness can lead us to make mistakes, but it's not irrational. Does that mean there's a tendency to believe that chance itself must obey certain rules? Actually, it's true that when you take into consideration both time, because you don't wait for the random dates to occur, and space, you imagine the selected events as if spread out across a surface far apart from each other. The aerial bombardments of London during the Second World War serve as a good historic example. The German aviators flew so high over the clouds that they couldn't see where the bombs were going, so they fell totally randomly. But when the British government looked at the map of the impacts, they could see that the bombs were concentrated in certain points that corresponded to no obvious military objective. They deduced that the Germans had bad maps. In reality, a statistical analysis showed that the targets weren't really chosen, they were randomly dispersed. Paradoxically, you explain that there's no doubt we owe the survival of our species to these cognitive illusions. It's better to see too many coincidences than too few. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that we've been conditioned to detect them. In an era when it could be a question of life or death, it was better to overinterpret coincidences and run away as soon as the leaves started rustling, which might indicate a predator, than to underestimate their importance and make no deductions. In any case, the scientific method consists of looking for coincidences and correlations and interpreting them through some other means than chance. This isn't irrational, but it's a risky method because it doesn't always produce reliable conclusions. For example, one a priori experiment, which was correctly conducted, proved the existence of a Mozart effect, by which people became smarter when they listened to Mozart. But when they tried to replicate it, it didn't work. You've got to assume that there was a false positive, which is something that must happen a lot. Illusions like these are the flaw in the rational method. Finally, where does our resistance to chance come from? Does it have to do with some pure cognitive incapacity, or does it arise out of fear? I don't think we're afraid of it, but in general, we like to have an explanation. That's why we invented science. Nevertheless, I don't really have an answer.